시작하면 될까요? 안녕하십니까. 탄소 중립을 위한 2050 장기 저탄소 발전 전략의 방향과 과제 토론회 오프닝 사회를 맡은 더불어민주당 이소영 의원 보좌관 김태우입니다. 반갑습니다. 오늘 뜻깊은 자리를 함께해 주신 기후솔루션, 환경부, 유럽연합과 바쁘신 가운데에도 토론회의 발제와 토론을 맡아주신 여러분께 감사드립니다. 우리나라는 기후변화에 대응하고 지속가능한 성장 토대 마련을 위해 그린 뉴딜을 새로운 정책 기조로 설정하였고 우리의 한국판 그린 뉴딜은 세계의 엄청난 주목을 받고 있습니다. 포브스, 가디언, 인디펜던스 등 유수의 외신들이 한국의 그린 뉴딜에 대해서 대대적으로 보도하고 있고 유엔 사무총장은 문재인 대통령에게 그린 뉴딜을 환영한다는 성안까지 보냈습니다. 유엔 산하의 기후변화에 대한 정부 간 협의체는 1.5도씨 특별보고서에서 전 지구적인 재앙을 막으려면 2050년에 탄소 순 배출량을 제로로 만들어야 한다고 했고 그 이후 73개 국가가 2050년 탄소 순 배출 제로를 선언했습니다. 지난 6월 전국 226개 모든 지방자치단체가 기후위기 비상선언을 선언했고 정부의 2050년 탄소 제로 달성을 요구했습니다. 17개 광역지자체도 탄소 순배출 제로 달성을 위한 지방정부 실천연대를 발족했습니다. 21대 국회에서도 지금까지 총 3건의 기후위기 비상선언 결의안을 발의되었고 이 결의안은 모두 2050년 순배출 제로 달성 목표를 선언하고 있습니다. 2050년까지 순배출을 제로로 만들겠다는 목표는 그린 뉴딜의 시작이라고 할 수 있습니다. 우리나라 정부는 2050년 탄소 순배출과 관련해 올해 말 유엔에 제출 예정인 2050년 장기 저탄소 발전 전략 논의를 통해 결정하겠다고 계획 중에 있습니다. 오늘 토론회가 2050년 장기 저탄소 발전 전략 제출을 4개월여 앞둔 중요한 시기에 개최되는 만큼 우리나라의 2050년 장기 저탄소 발전 전략 과제에 대한 건설적인 논의의 장이 되기를 기대합니다. 오늘 토론회는 코로나19 확산 방지와 발제자분들의 참석 여건을 고려하여 줌 화상회의로 진행되며 토론회 중 발제자와 토론자에 대한 질문은 하단의 Q&A를 통해 남겨주시면 됩니다. 기타 요청 사항은 좌측 하단의 채팅창에 메시지로 남겨주시면 감사하겠습니다. 그럼 오늘 토론회 발제자와 토론자 여러분을 소개해드리겠습니다. 먼저 토론회의 자장은 이창훈 한국환경정책평가연구원 선임연구원이십니다. 첫 번째 발제는 우르슐라 푸엔테스 클라이밋 애널리틱스 선임연구원님께서 2050년 탄소 중립 목표에 비친 한국의 2030 감축 목표 개선 방향에 대해 발표해 주실 것입니다. 두 번째로 리차드 밀라 영국 기후변화위원회 선임연구원님께서 영국의 탄소 중립 목표 전략에 대해 소개해 주실 것입니다. 세 번째로 로세프 아자르 프랑스 환경부 국장님께서 프랑스의 탄소 중립 목표와 전략에 대해 소개해 주실 것입니다. 네 번째로 커스트 보트만 독일 환경부 부국장께서 독일의 탄소 중립 목표 전략에 대해 소개해 주실 것입니다. 다섯 번째로 시타르트 파타크 2050 패스웨이 플랫폼 국장님께서 해외 각국의 LEDS 수립 주요 현황과 한국 LEDS 방향을 소개해 주실 예정입니다. 그리고 토론자로는 고덕규 환경부 기획전략과 서기관님께서 참석해 주셨습니다. 다음으로 성신의 산업부 에너지 혁신 정책과 서기관님께서 참석해 주셨습니다. 그리고 임재민 저탄소 사회 비전 포럼 청년국가위원님께서 참석해 주셨습니다. 그럼 지금부터 본격적으로 토론회를 시작하겠습니다. 오늘 사회의 좌장을 맡아주신 이창훈 선임 연구원님께서 진행해 주시겠습니다.
안녕하세요. 오늘 사회를 맡은 한국환경정책평가연구원 이창원입니다. 아까 사회자께서 얘기하셨듯이 한국은 올해 말까지 LEDS를 준비를 하고 있고요. 여기에서 가장 뜨거운 쟁점 중에 하나가 탄소 중립과 탄소 중립 시점을 어떻게 명시하느냐, 이 부분이 굉장히 뜨거운 쟁점 중에 하나입니다. 그래서 오늘 회의 친구들이 전체적으로 Climate Analytics에서 한국의 LEDS에 관련된 시사점을 한번 연구한 게 있어서 그 연구 보고서를 아마 요약해 주실 거라고 믿고 있고요. 그리고 영국과 프랑스에서 LEDS 수립 경험 및 두 국가의 LEDS 내용에 대해서 좀 설명을 해주시고, 마지막으로는 전체적으로 해외 각국의 LEDS 수립 현황과 한국 시사점에 대해서 2050년 패스웨이 플랫폼에서 좀 발표를 해주실 걸로 지금 기대를 하고 있습니다. 지금 현재 저희들이 주최 측에서 발제자들에게 약 15분씩의 발표를 부탁드렸기 때문에 이 발표 시간을 조금 준수해 주시길 부탁드리고요. 네 발표를 전부 다 듣고 나서 한국 측의 토론자로부터의 코멘트와 질문이 있겠습니다. 그리고 나서 줌으로 접속하신 여러 이제 100분 이상의 지금 청중들이 계신데요. 그 청중들의 질문이 있으면은 그 질문을 우리 토론자와 발표자에게 드리도록 하겠습니다. 우선 먼저 우슬라 푸엔테스 선임 연구원께서 2050 탄소 중립 목표에 비춘 한국의 2030 감축 목표 개선 방향에 대해서 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 부탁드립니다.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join this exciting discussion and this forum. I will share the screen and start my presentation. So yes, I'm working with climate analytics. Climate analytics is an climate and energy science and policy think tank institute based in Berlin, headquarters in Berlin, but with offices in other parts of the world. And I'm based in the Australia office in Perth in Western Australia, focusing on energy transition and mitigation strategies in the Asia Pacific. And before joining climate analytics, I have worked for the German government, including on developing the long-term strategy. So I'll also give a little insight into that discussion and development in Germany as well. So the Paris Agreement temperature goal, of course, is to hold warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit temperature to 1.5 in the light of the recent scientific assessments showing the risks of global warming exceeding this limit to globally and to many countries and regions of the world. And the Paris Agreement also outlines the emission pathways that needs to be achieved at a global level in order to achieve this temperature goal, which means peaking emissions as soon as possible and undertaking rapid reductions thereafter, and achieving a balance, so net zero emissions, in accordance with the best available science. And of course, shortly after, and with the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there was a mandate for the IPCC to provide a special report that was then adopted in 2018 that gave the most authoritative assessment, scientific assessment of the best available science to determine what it implies to achieve the temperature goal, and what it means in terms of the emission pathway. And last year, we have published a briefing that was with the support of the 2050 Pathways platform. So very pleased to see that here in contributing to this panel as well, looking into what we learn from the scientific assessment of mitigation pathways consistent with the Paris Agreement goal, and what the key milestones are on the path to achieving this goal, which essentially means achieving net zero emissions, but on a pathway with rapid reductions over the next decade or so, and the very important role of the electricity sector to be decarbonized ahead of 2050, in particular phasing out coal, but then also other fossil fuels, and transitioning to renewable energy, and the electrification of end-use sectors directly or indirectly, including through hydrogen. And that is one of the aspects that Korea has been also leading on. And in addition to the industrial or energy sectors, also the need to reduce emissions from agriculture and to turn the forest sector into a net sink. So this means transformation is needed across all energy sectors, a full transformation, and in addition, also a transformation in the land use sectors. The IPCC has also outlined the importance of developing long-term strategies to achieve this transformation and this pathway that leads us jointly to a pathway consistent with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And the opportunity is there, developing a long-term strategy to address all the need for the transformational change across all the sectors, and to have an all of the economy approach, and integrating this not only with climate goals, but also with other goals at national level and international level, in particular sustainable development goals. Now, one aspect that I'm focusing on is how does the development of the long-term strategy and the long-term net zero emissions goal, how does that link to the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, that are at the heart of the mitigation contributions of the parties to the Paris Agreement, and that typically include targets for the midterm, typically for the 2030 time horizon, like the NDC for South Korea. Now, the analysis of the pathways consistent with the Paris Agreement shows that the current NDCs jointly are not ambitious enough to get us jointly, globally, on a pathway that is consistent with the Paris Agreement. And what is needed is an improvement of the NDCs, and that is what the Paris Agreement is also asking for. But this improvement has to be really very transformational. So not just incremental improvement steps are needed. The analysis here of pathways analyzed by the IPCC shows that NDCs have to be improved collectively, reduced, the emissions level targeted has to be reduced by about 50% for 2030 in order to get on a pathway that is consistent with the temperature goal. And this is included in the the milestone of reaching a global reduction of 45% by 2030 compared to 2010. So that means all NDCs have to be improved to get us onto this pathway. And what we also learn is from the analysis of pathways that have been assessed by the IPCC, and these are many of these are so-called integrated assessment modeling pathways that look into the integration and look into least cost pathways at a global scale across the sectors and economies. And looking into the energy and industry emissions, what we see is that fossil fuel emissions have to be reduced very fast, but we still also need to achieve negative emissions, carbon dioxide removal, either through forestry or through other technologies, both for compensating for too high emissions in the past or for emissions that can't be reduced. But what we also see is that we have an option of limiting the reliance on this uptake of carbon dioxide if we manage to decarbonize the energy sector and end-use sectors faster, and if the efficiency potentials are also tapped into. So this is what we learned from the analysis of these IPCC pathways. The good news is that we are seeing a very dynamic technology development, in particular in the area of renewable energy, in particular wind and solar, and increasingly also storage technologies like batteries, and then also seasonal storage with the option of, for example, hydrogen playing a role in decarbonizing not only the electricity sector, but also end-use sectors. And many of the models that have been used by the IPCC in the pathways that the IPCC has assessed, the so-called integrated assessment models, have cost assumptions for these technologies like wind and solar that are higher than what we are already seeing today. And that means that often these models underestimate the potential for increased uptake of renewable energy, including with the latest developments of storage technologies and technologies to integrate higher shares of variable renewable energy. So what we're seeing is recently an almost exploding number of studies at global and regional and national level that show that electricity and also the whole energy system can be transformed into 100% or near 100% renewable energy. This has been increasing, and including for a country like South Korea, where it is also known that the costs for renewable energy have been higher than in other countries. Other countries have been able to use opportunities for larger transmission grids or larger renewable energy potential. But there are also studies, and here's an example that has been published last year for a transition to 100% renewable energy of the whole energy system in South Korea. Now, coming to the issue of the NDC target in South Korea and the importance of the ambition level of the NDC target being in line with a pathway consistent with the Paris Agreement and the net zero target, we have analyzed in a study published this year that we've done in collaboration with SFOC what these least cost global mitigation pathways imply for South Korea. So taking into account the specific situation in South Korea, the starting point, the energy system, and the existing policies and targets, looking into these global pathways, some of them, but only few, have a resolution that has South Korea presented as a country, but mostly they have a coarse resolution only representing a larger region. So we have a modeling framework that then scales this down to the South Korea national energy system, energy and industry system. And the resulting analysis shows where the pathways would lie and where the specific emission level would lie for South Korea to be consistent with a pathway to limit global temperature to 1.5 as per the Paris Agreement. So what you see here is the current emissions development for South Korea and the current projection, which implies still an increase in emissions. You see the current target, the current NDC target, and the domestic emission reduction target adopted currently. And the pathways that follow from the 1.5 pathways for South Korea, we have looked at a range of modeling pathways, of integrated assessment model pathways. This is the range that you see here. And also the IEA scenario, beyond 2 degrees scenario that we have used in other studies looking into the energy sector transformation in line with the Paris Agreement. If that is adjusted to the current historical emissions, then we see also a steep reduction possible and necessary for the national context. We have also compared this with what we derive within the Climate Action Tracker as a fair share range. So under equity considerations, what would a fair target be for South Korea? There are, of course, many different approaches to fairness and equity. So what we do is look at the wide range of proposals that have been made and look into what is a range that would then be consistent for South Korea. So from this analysis, looking at least cost pathways for South Korea and equity ranges for South Korea, we see that the overall NDC target would have to be more ambitious to achieve a 1.5 consistent equity range. And the domestic target would have to be more ambitious to achieve a least cost pathway that is consistent with a global least cost mitigation pathway. And therefore then also with a pathway consistent with a global net zero pathway. So the result of this analysis is that the domestic part of the NDC target that currently implies a 19% reduction in 2030 compared to 2017 would have to be scaled up to a reduction of 59% compared to 2017 by 2030 to be consistent with global pathways that minimize the reliance on carbon dioxide removal. This is, of course, a very large transformational step in terms of ambition. And the challenge is then to look into how this transformation is translated into sectoral transformations, in particular phasing out coal from electricity generation and then looking into other potentials across sectors of the economy. Now, I was asked to have give also a brief introduction into the German long-term strategy in the context of the EU long-term strategy. That Germany has adopted a climate action plan, so the long-term strategy that was also submitted to the UNFCCC in 2016. It was one of the first submitted back then. And it's a strategy for modernizing the economy and developing a pathway towards greenhouse gas neutrality, building on existing greenhouse gas reduction targets that the German government had already adopted, and then developing sectoral pathways and sectoral milestones and sectoral targets, but also a process of reviewing and updating in line with the Paris Agreement review and ratcheting up process and timeline. This goal of greenhouse gas neutrality has now been also legislated in a National Climate Act into last year, including the sectoral targets that are embedded in this long-term strategy for the 2030 milestone. And also a program, a climate action program to achieve this 2030 target has been adopted. And sectoral strategies are also being developed. So one of the core elements of this strategy are the sectoral targets for 2030 that are now also legislated by law to make sure that these are achieved through ministerial accountability and responsibility for sectoral strategies across all sectors. And an other important element are long-term strategies also at the sectoral level that look into the different pace of decarbonization and the different role of sectors, where some sectors, in particular agriculture, can't reduce emissions to zero, and others can be decarbonized faster, in particular electricity generation. Now, I want to point to one of the what we see as a flaw and in the way this strategy and the sectoral targets were decided, namely that the 2030 target that is currently existing for Germany is not really consistent with the pathway to greenhouse gas neutrality. So it's not consistent with the Paris Agreement. It's a target that has been adopted earlier in an energy concept that was not yet looking into greenhouse gas neutrality. So it's consistent with a pathway that only achieves something like an 80% reduction. And we have calculated, similar to the approach for Korea, we have calculated what does it mean for Germany to be on a pathway consistent with the Paris Agreement. And similar to Korea, also Germany would have to enhance its target to more than 70% reduction, in this case, compared to 1990, which is the German base year, to be consistent with such a pathway. And similarly, the German coal phase out that has been decided and is being currently discussed or developed in terms of legislation. The flaw here was that the mandate for the coal phase out was set in the context of the existing 2030 target, which is not consistent with a pathway to greenhouse gas neutrality. And therefore, a phase out timeline has been decided that is not consistent with the Paris Agreement. OECD countries need to phase out coal by 2030 to be consistent with the Paris Agreement. So the currently decided pathway would not be consistent with it and would have to be adjusted at some point. Now, what do we learn from this for the context of the discussion in South Korea? It's of course something that has attained a lot of international attention, the discussion about a Green New Deal and the adoption of a net zero target for South Korea. An economy that is currently still very much relying on fossil fuels, and of course an economy that is also growing and also largely export oriented and with energy intensive industry. But there is this opportunity to link the discussion about the Green New Deal and the opportunities of the Green New Deal and the development of the long-term strategy, and the need to link this with looking at the current NDC target and looking into how this can be enhanced to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And of course, 2020 is a critical year because it is the year where parties to the Paris Agreement are asked not only to develop the long-term strategy, but also to enhance their NDCs and ratchet up their NDCs to make them consistent with the Paris Agreement. And to address the transformational contributions that are then needed by all sectors, in particular the transition away from coal and other fossil fuels, and looking into the opportunities of a fast decarbonization of the power sector and the link to other sectors through electrification. As I pointed out, coal phase out is one of the key elements of such a strategy, and the transformation to renewable energy with all the benefits that come with this, also at the economic level and in terms of health and avoiding air pollution. And the significant potential coming with the technology development for expanding photovoltaics and wind, but also for developing a hydrogen economy, which is one of the objectives, I understand, that has been also discussed in South Korea, and the opportunity for focusing this on green hydrogen. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to other contributions and to the discussion and questions you might have on this presentation. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다. Dr. Ursula Fuentes. 그 2050년 탄소 중립 목표에 맞춰서 한국의 2030년 NDC를 어떻게 강화해야 되고 어느 정도 높여야 되고 그리고 높이기 위한 어떤 전략들, 뭐 탈탄소 전략들, 재생에너지 확대 전략들, 수소 경제 전략들에 대해서 조금 조언을 해주셨고요. 특히 독일의 LEDS 관련 사항들도 조금 말씀해 주신 것 같습니다. 토론자 및 다른 그 참여자들의 질문과 코멘트는 전체 4분의 발표를 전체 다 듣고 나서 한꺼번에 좀 듣도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. 두 번째 발표자는 영국의 탄소 중립 목표와 전략에 대해서 리차드 밀러 선임연구원께서 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 부탁드립니다. 그 하단의 화면 공유 버튼을 눌러주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Great. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen and my slides. Thank you very much for the organisers for inviting us to speak today. Looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentations and learning a lot in the rest of the session. So I'm going to speak about the UK's contribution to ending climate change and specifically the new net zero target for 2050 in the UK. So just to start with a slide on the background, the UK's had a Climate Change Act since 2008. There are 4 key bits of that act as we see it. One is the long-term target, a goal for 2050 emissions. Second is a pathway to that target, a set of 5-yearly carbon budgets that step down from emissions where we are today through to the long-term target, the now net zero target for 2050. A toolkit, a requirement for the government to bring forward policies to actually meet the long-term target and the carbon budgets, and a monitoring framework, including an independent expert body, the Committee on Climate Change, which I'm here representing today, to help monitor progress and suggest changes to the UK government. And just to provide slightly more context on the Committee on Climate Change, so there are 2 committee boards for that, covering mitigation with one and adaptation to climate change with the other, about 14 independent committee members, experts from academia and industry across those 2 boards, and supported by a secretariat of about 25 analysts. So the challenge for reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the UK is set in the context of what's happened with UK emissions since 1990. Since 1990, the UK economy has grown by nearly 80%, while emissions have come down. The territorial emissions in the UK have fallen by about 40% since 1990 levels, so still indicating about a 60% reduction will be needed by 2050 to deliver on that net zero target. And also you can see with this green line here that the UK's consumption emissions have also fallen since 2008, steadily since 2008 when the Act's been in place, which indicates that the actions that have been taken in the UK to reduce its emissions have had a genuine impact on its global carbon footprint. As I was mentioning, there are a set of carbon budgets in the UK that allow us to step down toward the long-term target. We currently have 5 carbon budgets legislated in the UK so far, which you can see by the grey blocks in this figure here. They extend out to 2032, and they were set on the path to the previous long-term target, which was an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which you can see with the green dot on the right-hand side of the figure. So at the moment, now we have this new long-term target of net zero emissions by 2050. We're looking at what's the right path over this period to get down to it. This blue line here just shows an indicative straight line path down to net zero in 2050. And the committee is currently thinking about what is the right level for the 6th carbon budget, so the emissions around mid-2030s for the UK that might be consistent with getting down to net zero by 2050. So the first thing I want to talk about, turning to the net zero target specifically in the UK, is why net zero? And when we considered this in our advice to the government last year, our answer to this was very much grounded in the international obligations of the Paris Agreement. So these trajectories here show the global average per person emissions in scenarios that achieve the Paris Agreement. The red plume are ones that keep warming to roughly about 1.5 degrees C, and the blue ones are ones that are about a 2/3 chance of staying below 2 degrees C. And you can see that emissions per person in the global average need to come down rapidly and reach net zero before the end of the century. For the UK, our emissions per capita have come down from about 2 times the global average in 1990 to be about similar to the global average per person emissions today. And the grey dot there on 2050 shows our net zero target, which would mean the UK going to net zero greenhouse gases in advance of the global average in nearly all these pathways that actually keep warming to 1.5 degrees C, which we think would be right given the UK's strong historical contribution to climate change to date. So can we actually achieve it? What would achieving net zero greenhouse gases in the UK actually mean? So for this, we did a bottom-up assessment of all the different sources of emissions in the UK economy. So you can see on the left-hand side of this chart here, here's a stack of emissions that represent the sources of emissions in the UK today. And because the power sector emissions have fallen in the UK rapidly over recent times, the biggest sector of emissions today is actually the transport sector in light blue on the top of that stack. So we conducted a bottom-up assessment looking at all these different sources of emissions and saying, can they go to zero and how rapidly can they do so? And for nearly all of these sectors, we actually concluded that they could all come to really close to absolute zero emissions. So you can see in the middle column there that many of these sectors, for instance, power, industry, surface transport, can all come to really, really low levels of emissions by 2050, with only a tiny slither of truly unavoidable emissions from those sectors that might need to be compensated by greenhouse gas removals to get to the greenhouse gas neutrality that we're pursuing. Sectors where we think it's going to be slightly more challenging to get to really, really low levels of emissions are the ones in the right-hand column there, which are specifically agriculture and aviation. So agriculture, particularly with emissions such as methane from cattle, which are going to be unavoidable to some extent, although we can significantly reduce them in the UK by 2050, will require some greenhouse gas removals to offset those. But we do think looking at both land-based removals in the UK and more engineered removals such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and potentially direct air capture, that there is potential to compensate for what we might not be able to avoid within these particular sectors and reach greenhouse gas net zero across the whole UK economy by 2050. One of the things we were asked to talk about in this presentation is, did we find multiple ways of getting to net zero? And we did look at a few different ways of getting to net zero. We thought that for most of the sectors, there's going to be a set of options that are going to be required in all cases to get down towards net zero. But we did look at the sort of this last little bit of abatement, this last little bit of emissions reduction, around sort of 40 megatons of CO2 in our calculations, where we could see multiple options for closing out that last gap. We group these into three different categories. The top row here basically refers to a deeper rollout of the kinds of actions we're needing to see already in the economy. And a lot of these might involve more or higher levels of behavior change to achieve them. So for instance, our standard scenario has per capita red meat consumption falling by about 20% per person by 2050. If we were to go further and reach a 50% reduction, then that would enable us to save emissions there and get close to net zero. Similarly, using a few more percentage points of UK land for planting forests might also help sequester some more emissions. We also looked at the potential for slightly higher levels of engineered removals in the UK to help compensate for that, and did identify potential for slightly higher use of either bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, if that proves cost effective by 2050, to help compensate for that last little bit of either emissions reduction or removals needed to get to absolute net zero by 2050. And then the final category is what we might term more tech breakthrough worlds. So if it does become possible to produce carbon neutral synthetic fuels, either using direct air capture, for instance, to take carbon out of the air, then this might be something that could be used within aviation, for instance, to remove that last little bit of emissions that might be needed to get down to net zero. So while we might not be sure on all of these being delivered, when we looked across these different ways of closing out the final gap to net zero, we were relatively confident that enough of these could come through that we could have a net zero target in the UK and confidently deliver it by 2050. So I'm just going to have two very quick slides now on some high-level assessment of some of the sectoral challenges. So this first one specifically looks at industry. So industry was one of the key sectors we thought about in whether we can achieve a net zero target in the UK. And when we actually looked at it, we did think actually that there are options to get our industrial emissions to very, very low levels. And there's a whole range of different abatement options that are contributing to that picture. So this slide summarizes some of them as we try to capture it, but just to quickly speak to a couple of them. We think resource efficiency is going to be a really important part of this. So that means just doing things more efficiently, for instance, using less steel in buildings where that's possible is going to actually help push down the demand for industrial emissions in the UK. But obviously there's going to be a strong role for fuel switching within there. So that's going to be electrification in many industrial sectors, but also a substantial hydrogen economy. And we think actually the hydrogen economy will need to be roughly about the size of the power sector in the UK today, across all the uses in 2050, which requires about a 10 times scale up. And obviously that hydrogen needs to be produced in a low carbon way. But even with the fuel switching, there are going to be some process emissions. So for instance, emissions coming from cement production that are going to be unavoidable. And we're going to need to have carbon capture and storage available to be able to deal with those emissions and reduce them right down to net zero. Similarly, the building sector is going to be one of the biggest challenges for reaching net zero emissions in the UK, and potentially an area where a decent fraction of the costs may lie. There are multiple aspects to dealing with that challenge. Again, we're confident that those options exist and can be pursued. They're going to cover a range of things. For instance, new homes. We think new homes should be built with low carbon heating systems by 2025 at latest, to make sure we're not locking in carbon stock with high carbon emissions within the UK. But we're also going to need to deal with our existing building stock, which in the UK is very varied. Some of it is poorly insulated. So insulation is going to be a key bit of that, but also is fitting these buildings with heat pumps, for instance, to electrify our heating, and potentially some role for hydrogen through the gas grid to deal with peak heating demands. But again, we think these options exist, and with the right funding mechanisms in place, tackling the real barriers that actually can be identified there, that this can be delivered if we get on with this and pursue it in the near term in the UK. So to zoom out quickly again to some higher level takeaways, lessons that we learned at least from our scenarios. So I'm going to just speak to a few of those on this slide now. And the first one I think is really important is the strategic priority of the electricity sector. So in all of our scenarios, we see a really important role for electrification in delivering the abatement that's needed across the economy. When we actually look at the different uses of electrification, we think that the power sector is going to need to roughly double in the UK from the size it is today by 2050. And obviously all of that is going to be needing to be very close to zero carbon. So that's about a 4 times scale up in the size of the low carbon electricity sector between now and 2050 in the UK. We're making good progress on that front, but it's clear that that's absolutely integral that we deliver that if we're going to deliver our net zero target. And then probably the other thing I'd like to pull out from this slide is the idea of uncertainty and options. So it's clear that not all bits of the net zero pathway and the pathway to it are going to be absolutely known today. We will learn things over the course of the process of getting down our emissions. But I think one thing we think is critical is to pursue options and develop them, and not just wait and see. So where there are multiple avenues, we should be pushing on all of these to see which ones will actually come through in the real world. And that requires policy action from government and also from business to ensure that happens today. Of course, all of this does require a huge transformation across all the sectors of the economy. They all have to participate. These charts here just show a few arrows indicating a rough summary of what we think needs to happen when to deliver these scenarios within each sector. I'm not going to go through them all, but hopefully you can spend some time looking at the slides to see them in detail. But I think the core message to draw out is that a lot of these things really require actions to start today, and particularly the 2020s needs to be a decade where these options are developed and rolled out, so that we can then push them through the capital stock over the coming decades and make sure we can reach that net zero target in the most efficient way, avoiding things like scrappage where that's going to be costly and unnecessary. So for instance, the EV market in the UK, we want to see the date for phase out come forward slightly to about the mid 2030s, where petrol vehicles are phased out, meaning that there's a high chance that if that's the case in 2030s, then we can roll through the fleet and be confident that there will be just zero emissions vehicles on the road by 2050. So just a couple more slides now coming towards the end to talk about the costs. So we looked at costs for net zero, and actually when we looked at this in total, we thought the costs are actually far lower than we might have imagined a decade ago. And a good reason for why this is the case is that technology progress has just happened faster than analysts, including ourselves, thought about a decade or so ago. So just to give one quick example, this chart on the left here shows the levelized cost of electricity from offshore wind in the UK, with the red line being a government projection from about 2012. And you can see from the dots on the graph, which represent actual contracts that have already been signed in the UK to date, that we're already at a levelized cost of offshore wind that's below what projections were for 2030s. And there's similar stories in other areas. For instance, the graph on the right shows a similar story with the costs of battery packs coming down faster. When totaling all of that up, we actually think, therefore, now that this net zero target for 2050 could be delivered for about the same cost as what we thought the 80% target could be delivered for when we first recommended this back in 2008, this 1 to 2% of GDP. And it's important to flag that that cost is a resource cost. It's a technical cost of all these different abatement measures, but it doesn't include some of the co-benefits that are going to come with this scenario. For instance, cleaner air, more active travel that have substantial health co-benefits alongside them, and also the wider economic impacts, the clean growth opportunities, potential export opportunities for the UK. And when we do include those factors, the evidence suggests that it's plausible that this cost range might span zero. For instance, it might be actually a boon to the UK economy overall to pursue this net zero target, so it might have no cost associated with it. Delivering net zero, so just a couple of quick slides on this. We looked across all the different options that we had in our scenarios, and it's in a rough calculation, it's roughly about 2/3 of them that we think is going to either require some moderate level or a high level of engagement with people to deliver. And that's different from a lot of the progress we've made in the UK so far, which has happened in the power sector and has required limited engagement. So we really think that engaging with people, particularly with sectors such as building and heatings, are going to be really important for actually delivering these scenarios. So activities such as the Citizens Climate Assembly, which we've seen in the UK recently, will be useful for actually drumming up this engagement and making sure it's sustainable over time. And the very final slide, the flip side to that, of course, is engagement from business as well. A huge amount of this mitigation in our scenarios will have to be delivered by UK businesses, and they've been very supportive of the UK climate framework so far. They valued the predictability, certainty, and transparency of the long-term target and the carbon budget framework. And indeed, many businesses supported the legislation of this net zero target, and the Confederation for British Industries, the CBI, which is a body that covers many of the large businesses in Britain, have been coordinating a lot of that. So it's going to be really integral that we maintain that business support as we think about how we're actually going to deliver on the net zero target for net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the UK by 2050. Thank you very much.
영국의 탄소 중립 목표를 1990년 대비 2050년 80% 감축에서 100% 감축인 넷제로로 이행하는 과정에서 여러 가지 옵션들, 그다음에 희망적인 소식은 그럼에도 불구하고 비용은 늘어나지 않을 거라는 희망적인 소식도 같이 조금 전해주셨습니다. 감사합니다. 다음은 프랑스의 탄소 중립 목표와 전략에 대해서 미스터 조셉 아자르 국장께서 발표를 해주시겠습니다.
Hi everybody, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see it now? Just to be sure. Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'm Joseph Ajar from the French Ministry for an Ecological Transition. I'm very happy to talk to you about our revised low carbon strategy. And actually, we've had the idea of having a long-term carbon strategy since 2015 when we issued our first long-term strategy. And it was recently revised I will come back to this. So this strategy is our roadmap for our mitigation policies, and it's consistent with all our European and national targets and milestones. And the way it works, as for the UK, is that it sets long-term objectives by 2050, but also carbon budgets for 3 periods of 5 years that are based on a scenario, and this is how we sort of link the short term with the long term. And our strategy defines policy orientations that we need to pursue if we want to achieve our goals. And the idea is that this strategy is revised every 5 years so that we can take into account the evolution of technologies, for instance, what we observed in the recent years, and more generally, the evolution of our knowledge. So where are we today? As you know, France has among the lowest GHG emissions per capita within the EU and G20. And we achieved significant reductions of our emissions since 1990. And the first low carbon strategy in 2015 aimed at dividing by 4 our national emissions by 2050. But on the other hand, we've had some delays in emission reductions in the recent years. And actually, we were not able to meet the first carbon budget that was set in our strategy. So we recognize that new measures and stronger measures need to be put in place if we want to speed up our reductions and stay on our trajectory. So that's why in 2017, there was a willingness to raise our ambition to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And so we began a revision of this strategy. And we did this first by launching an early public consultation and got many answers to this. And then went through the whole modeling process with the involvement of many stakeholders to draft the document itself and its orientations. And we published the final draft for public consultation early 2020, and it has been officially published in April, so very recently. And so the new strategy takes into account our goal of being climate neutral by 2050, and soon it will be notified to UNFCCC as France's long-term strategy under this framework. Just a quick word on how we worked, because all of this is backed with an ambitious and inclusive modeling process. So we used sectoral models to represent the whole economy from now to 2050, and then aggregated this result to get consistent energy balances and GHG emissions trajectory. And at the end, we also perform a socio and macroeconomic analysis of the trajectory to see how it can affect our GDP, our jobs, but also the household's income and energy bills, etc. And at the same time, we had an intensive stakeholder participation process with different levels, one very general level, one more sectoral level with sectoral experts and members from the industry, etc. And also modeling working groups, more focusing on running the models, discussing the assumption, etc. And in all these levels, it was not just only the ministry, but also the other ministry, because it's a whole of government action, but also NGOs, trade unions, the private sector, etc. So there was a very strong, inclusive and consultation process. This is somehow the result of all this modeling exercise. It's our with additional measure scenario. It's our pathway somehow to get to our objective. So you can see the emissions and the carbon sinks evolving and balancing themselves in 2050. You can also see the carbon budgets that are represented on this figure. And what is important is that our objective is economy-wide, which means that all sectors are included in this objective. It's also country-wide, so all France regions are included, including overseas regions. This objective is also without offsetting, so without using international carbon credits, for example. And finally, this objective includes all greenhouse gases. So to sum it up, this objective is consistent with the perimeter of the greenhouse gases inventory that we submit to UNFCCC, and this was also very important for us. This is a snapshot of the situation in 2050. where you can see the residual emissions and carbon sinks in 2050. So as you can see, we have residual emissions, mostly coming from the agriculture sector and also from the industry sector with industrial processes that are not easy to abate. And on the other hand, we had the carbon sink, which will be developed, which will rely on the forest sink, which in France is already a net carbon sink. But we will also need to develop other land sink, which is linked to agriculture practices and stopping the artificialization. We also rely strongly on the development of long-lived wood products in the economy, mostly in the building sectors, as they can act as a carbon sink as well. And lastly, we will need to reasonably use carbon capture and storage to get this balance. But we don't want to rely too much on these technologies as they are not available today. So we stick to a reasonable use of and limited use of CCS. All this work around the scenario is important because it teaches us some lessons about what we need to do if we want to achieve our objective by 2050. And first of all, we cannot reach this objective without a strong decrease in our energy consumption. It's important, and our strategy foresees that our final energy consumption will be divided by almost 2 between nowadays level and 2050. And this is done through energy efficiency, but also energy temperance and sufficiency. We need to fully decarbonize our energy productions by 2050 as well. So no more fossil fuels in the economy by 2050, except a bit in the aviation sector. And we will do this relying mostly on biomass, on renewable heat from the environment, and on decarbonized electricity production, be it nuclear or renewable. We also need to limit our non-energy related emissions in the agriculture and industrial processes, as I mentioned. And something that is a bit new, as we now aim for climate neutrality, is that we need to pay attention to the carbon sinks as well through forest management, through the development of long-lived wood products, through land management, and through the development at a reasonable level of CCS. At the end of the day, it's important to see that we learn that this objective is actually very ambitious because the trajectory is not easy to follow at all, but it's reachable, it's realistic. We didn't bet on any unknown technologies or things that are absolutely not available today. So all in all, we are convinced that this is reachable, although it requires a strong action starting today. We also assessed that it was desirable from an economic perspective. I will come back to this, not mentioning the other important co-benefits that was said by my colleagues from the UK. So the first one being, of course, fighting climate change, but you can also think about air pollution, biodiversity conservation, etc. And this is also very important to keep in mind. How do we translate then all this work around this scenario into public policies? We do it by translating lessons learned from the scenario into orientations that will help shaping the policies. And we have orientations at the governance level, some orientations that are cross-cutting, and some of them which are much more sectoral, and all of these are included in our strategy. Just to give you some examples here, I will only take one, but we saw in the modeling process that biomass was a critical resource, that we cannot use the biomass everywhere in every sector. And therefore, to decarbonize, we need to electrify energy consumption in some sectors, for example, passenger cars, industry, etc. And this is why, for instance, we rely strongly on electrifying passenger cars rather than developing biofuels, because biofuels require biomass, and we need biomass for sectors that are harder to decarbonize, actually. If we take a more detailed look at the building sector, we see that by 2050, we need a fully efficient building stock. So the orientations in our strategy about the building sector are about massively retrofitting the public and private building stock. They are about using a balanced heating mix, mostly based on heat pumps, on heating networks, and to a lesser extent on biomass and biogas. They also insist on life cycle material impact for the construction sector. And finally, we also have orientations about sufficiency and behavioral changes as the way that people live in their buildings and use their appliances is very important as well. About the industrial sector, of course, developing low carbon industries requires massively developing energy efficiency in all branches of the industry, and also decarbonizing the energy usage, mostly through biomass, biogas, and electricity, be direct or indirect with hydrogen, for instance. But we also focus on enhancing eco-design and circular economy in order to reduce our need for resources and our waste production. So this is also very important because it's the global picture. As I mentioned earlier, we carried out socio and macroeconomic analysis of our strategy, our pathway, to see how it affected our economy, and we see that compared with the business as usual scenario, it's actually beneficial both for GDP, for job creations, and for the household's energy bills, and this is also very important. So it's slightly beneficial. It's not huge figures, but still it shows that this is desirable even from an economic point of view. But obviously, this transformation will require sustained investments in all the different sectors. So this means that there will be a need for public support. First of all, for households, as not all of them will be able to support buying electric cars, for example, which are more expensive, or refurbishing buildings. So we need to support households and mostly the most vulnerable ones. But more generally, there is a need for public aid and public policies that will trigger the effective realization of the necessary investments. And this is done through standards, through information and support programs, bonus penalty schemes, carbon pricing. There are many tools available, but all of them are complementary and necessary actually if we want to give the right signals. Just to give you an example, we assessed the climate investment that we have today in France, around 45 billion euros nowadays, and these would need to almost double by the end of the decade and then triple by the end of the period if we want to reach the transformations that we need in the different sectors. How do we intend to implement the strategy now that it's been finalized and published? The strategy itself, as I mentioned, doesn't contain very detailed measures, but rather policy orientations. So then it's very important for us to make sure that the sectoral plans, the sectoral policies are consistent with our strategy. And for example, the multi-annual energy plan that covers the energy sectors was updated at the same time of our long-term strategy to make sure that they are fully consistent. And so this is very important, as energy is a very important sector, but we need to do this in every sector and every kind of policy. And this is what we are doing now. And also all the ministries will have to commit to implementation roadmaps that are consistent with our strategy and that are designed to achieve the sectoral targets. And this will help ensuring that we have whole of government action to help us meeting our climate targets. So it's not just our ministry that is in charge of this strategy. So what next? The climate neutrality objective is now at a legal level, and this is also very, very important for us. Obviously, we want to communicate about the strategy and its orientations as widely as possible so that every actor can also contribute to the transformations that we need. As I said, we need to ensure that policies are in line with the strategy. Some important thing is that we also published many indicators together with the strategy, and we will follow up yearly and publish yearly indicators so that everybody can see whether we are on the right track or not. We also want to monitor contributions from NGOs, academics, companies, as all this process somehow triggered a public debate around the climate neutrality pathway. And this is very interesting because in return, it will help us when we update the strategy in 5 years to make it more and more realistic and robust and consistent. So yeah, it's a kind of cycle. And climate governance is also very important. So last year, we created a High Council for Climate, which is a body of independent experts like the UK presented, and that issues analysis about the government climate action. We also created a kind of environmental cabinet, so it brings together the different ministers that are responsible for environment issues to foster cross-cutting action for the environment in the government. And lastly, we've had a citizen climate convention. So this was 150 randomly chosen citizens that were asked to work together and come up with some proposals of policy measures that will help meeting our objectives. And they recently published the result of this work. And it's very interesting because you have some very ambitious measures that are proposed by the citizens. And we are now in the process of seeing how we can actually translate these into policies, into actual policies. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that nowadays a growing number of countries are committing to similar objectives worldwide, and it's a very good signal, and we hope that this movement will continue and amplifies. At the EU level, we are committed to ensure that we can collectively be as ambitious as possible. And as you know, there are ongoing discussions at the EU level to raise our 2030 targets from -40 to -50 to 55%. And this is also very important for us, and we are very committed to this process. So thank you very much. Obviously, it was a very quick overview, but we are always happy to discuss. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you want to have more insight on some specific issues. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다, Mr. 조셉 아잘. 그 프랑스의 저탄소 전략, 이번에 4월 달에 개정된 저탄소 전략에 대해서 상세하게 좀 설명을 해주셨고요. 분야별 옵션, 그리고 재밌는 거는 이런 5년짜리 전략이 매년 그 정부의 계획이 어떻게 반영을 할 것인지 임플리멘테이션까지 좀 설명을 해주신 것 같습니다. 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 다음은 전체적으로 그 각 개별 국가가 아니라 전체 세계에서 LEDS 수립 현황과 그 다음에 우리나라가 지금 현재 수립하고 있는 LEDS 방향에 대해서 2050 패스웨이 플랫폼의 미스터 시타타 파탁 씨께서 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 부탁드립니다.
Thank you for having me here, and a very good afternoon to you all. I'll just share my screen. Like you've heard the previous speakers give you very specific details, and I especially want to thank Ursula, Richard, and Joseph for actually going into a lot of details on the sectors as well as a lot of options in terms of policies that they've chosen. I wanted to take a sort of a broad overview snapshot of how Korea is contextualized and how Korean long-term strategy will actually be contextualized within a broader sort of spectrum of long-term strategies that are coming across the world. So just to give you a sort of brief sense of where the platform sort of stands, the platform, the 2050 Pathways platform was created or founded at COP16, primarily with the leadership of the high-level champions at that point. It's a multi-country, multi-stakeholder sort of initiative, primarily to help countries develop their long-term strategies. primarily, the platform directly supports countries and its member countries with developing the long-term strategy and providing specific advisory role as well as financial sort of assistance and technical assistance towards them. And we try to sort of definitely facilitate these sort of discussions where different experts from other countries actually come and talk to each other in order to help different countries with ideas as well as queries, because everybody is doing the long-term strategy for the first time after the Paris Agreement. Some countries have done it before, but not with the context of the Paris Agreement that Ursula sort of talked about. So there is a lot to learn from each other, and we want to try and facilitate that. And finally, obviously, it's a sort of community of practice, and we have a lot of individuals who try to be as helpful as possible in the exchange amongst countries. So as of now, to date, around 17 countries have submitted their long-term strategy. As you can see, a lot of the countries that have submitted their long-term strategy, like Joseph also said, and also Richard, that there is a continual sort of updating process of these long-term strategies. So I wouldn't take the first set of long-term strategies as an indicator of how the long-term strategies can be, because as countries are developing the long-term strategies, they're actually improving upon it. And with also greater sort of emphasis on science, greater insights into technologies, I think countries are very, very willing and ready to update their long-term strategies rather quickly. So you have France, you have UK, you have the Germany sort of revising and rethinking how they want to approach their long-term strategy. And a lot of other countries are also developing their long-term strategy. I think the biggest sort of gap in terms of countries that are yet to undertake long-term strategies is in the African continent. But we are trying to sort of help a lot of the African countries also to start developing their long-term strategy, because their context is slightly different. But overall, we are expecting by COP26, there'll be over 50 long-term strategies that will be submitted. And mostly all G20 countries would have submitted their long-term strategies by then. So there are many, many countries that are actually undertaking the long-term strategies right now. So just to give you a sense of the different sort of context in which the long-term strategy is being developed, as well as the different groups where long-term strategy is developed, and where specifically net zero is sort of reflected. And I'll come back to why I say reflection on net zero and not necessarily net zero long-term strategy. So as you can see, amongst the 37 OECD countries, 31 countries are already sort of intending to reflect on net zero in their long-term strategies. There are 6 members amongst this 37 countries in OECD that are yet to sort of decide on where and how do you want to reflect net zero, and amongst them is obviously Korea. But also countries like Mexico and the US, where they submitted their strategies much early on, but haven't necessarily talked about net zero in the way that newer strategies are talking about it. In the G7 countries, obviously 6 of them are reflecting on net zero. A lot of them are actually aiming towards net zero as their primary target, like Joseph also said for France and for UK, where the strategy is primarily aimed to get the emissions to net zero, and it's not part of the many scenarios that are within the long-term strategy. In the G20, it's a slightly different picture. Obviously, there are many emerging economies that are still contemplating how to reflect on the long-term strategy, how to reflect on net zero emissions in the long-term strategy. And you could see on the right-hand side how there are some of these emerging economies that are still considering this. Not to say that they're not going to undertake a net zero long-term strategy or not going to reflect on the net zero dimension in the long-term strategy, but they are still sort of undecided on it. And finally, I just wanted to come to the CNC, which is the Carbon Neutrality Coalition, and I'll speak to that in the next slide, which has 29 members, out of which 25 have already sort of are thinking about how to reflect net zero in their long-term strategy. And amongst them, obviously, Korea is a part of the Carbon Neutrality Coalition, and Mexico, Korea, Ethiopia, and Timor-Leste are the 4 countries that are still thinking about how to reflect on their net zero in the long-term strategy itself. Amongst the country groups that have already committed to having long-term strategies that will aim towards net zero, there's obviously the EU that sort of as a group has decided that they will want to do long-term strategies that are aiming towards net zero. There's also the least developed countries group, the Alliance of Small Island States, as well as the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And you have the memberships there, 49, 44, 48 countries. Obviously, there's a bit of an overlap on some of them, but all these groups have publicly committed in different political forums that they want to undertake the long-term strategy, and they would like the long-term strategies to be net zero. So when you're sort of coming back to reflecting on the long-term strategy in itself and how net zero is sort of undertaken in the long-term strategy, we've seen amongst the strategies that are being developed or have been submitted, there are sort of 3 criteria or categories that you could think of. The first one is having a very clear net zero objective in the long-term strategy from which you backcast the country's emissions. So it's very clear that the country wants to undertake the emissions to go to complete net zero. And amongst them, obviously, is Costa Rica, Portugal, New Zealand, which is going to submit its long-term strategy very soon, as well as Marshall Islands, where the goal is to actually undertake a net zero long-term strategy. In the other strategies like European Union, Fiji, Canada, there are sort of multiple scenarios. And amongst those multiple scenarios, there's a scenario on net zero. From what I understand in the draft strategy that the Ministry of Environment has prepared in Korea, there is obviously a least emission sort of scenario. It's still not net zero, but the way it's sort of designed is that there are multiple scenarios for different levels of emissions that Korea would intend to undertake. And there are obviously policy measures for these different scenarios in itself. So there are obviously, there is a typology of net zero, reflecting on net zero, in which you have net zero as a scenario and not necessarily the ultimate goal. And you basically have policy measures towards that particular scenario, not necessarily a definitive direction of travel. And then there are countries that have a sort of undefined net zero objective, and amongst them is obviously Japan, Singapore, Benin, Czech Republic, where the idea is to sort of reflect that we would like to get to net zero, or they've sort of proclaimed that they would want to become net zero at a period of time, but haven't necessarily talked about it in the scenarios or haven't given enough details about the scenarios to say whether the country's emissions could actually get to net zero or not, as well as hasn't necessarily sort of given a specific or given specific details about it. They've just given it as a broader principle that the country would like to pursue the goal of net zero in line with the Paris Agreement, but isn't necessarily going into too many details on how and in some cases by when. So just coming back on the timelines for net zero, amongst the OECD countries, mostly it's mid-century or earlier, that we see that most of these OECD countries, where Korea is also an OECD member, are looking at net zero in 2050 or earlier. In Finland's case, it's actually more ambitious, so it's 2035. In some other countries, or in the way some of the emerging economies are looking at it, the net zero timeline is actually beyond 2050. So it's in a bracket of either 2050 to 2060. In Japan and Singapore's case, they've sort of used the language directly from the Paris Agreement, which talks about getting to net zero in the second half of the century without giving a precise year at which the emissions will get to net zero. So it's like I said, it's sort of an undefined objective and is left ambiguous primarily for different reasons amongst the countries in itself. So coming back to the sort of international momentum on carbon neutrality and net zero, there's obviously, you've heard that at the last COP, the Chilean presidency launched the Climate Ambition Alliance, where around 120 countries committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. You could visit their website and see which of those countries there are. But amongst them, obviously, is the Carbon Neutrality Coalition, which includes Korea, and primarily was set up as an objective for countries to come together as a front-running force on long-term strategies that are committing to net zero or the long-term objectives of Paris Agreement. So there are these sort of multiple initiatives at the country level that are being established or have been established, where there are a group of countries that are aiming towards getting to net zero by 2050. And like I said, the Carbon Neutrality Coalition particularly is focused on long-term net zero strategies in itself, while the Climate Ambition Alliance is a group of countries that are broadly looking at getting to net zero by 2050. It's not just limited to countries, and with the UK presidency, there's an even renewed focus on non-state actors as well. They've just launched an initiative called Race to Zero, where there are around nearly 500 cities, 21 regions, and around 1,000 businesses, as well as investors that are committing to net zero. So it's not just limited to countries and the country strategies towards net zero, but there are a lot of non-state actors that are actively trying to look at net zero emissions and committing to net zero targets. This includes some of the big tech giants like Apple and Microsoft that are committing to carbon negative or carbon neutral sort of companies in itself. And amongst the financial actors, there is a very keen interest on shifting towards net zero. The most recent one is this coalition of finance ministers that is anchored through the World Bank, where around 52 finance ministers are aiming to help country or aiming to get their countries to develop their long-term strategies in line with net zero. Similarly, there are different facilities from the World Bank to IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, the French Development Agency, as well as the German Climate Initiative, that have specific windows or specific financial incentives for countries to actually undertake their long-term strategy. They don't necessarily apply to Korea, but there is a growing sense within the financial community that the long-term strategy, and especially a net zero long-term strategy, is quite beneficial for future investments that a lot of these entities will make. And so getting countries to develop their long-term strategy obviously makes a lot of sense. So, and it ranges from public investors and public financiers to international investors that are also looking at net zero as a goal. So what specifically can be done in the long-term strategy outside of obviously what Joseph and Richard sort of talked about, as well as Ursula, in terms of specifics? But broadly speaking, in a lot of countries where we are present and where we're having conversations, the political environment is not conducive for the time being to actually commit to decarbonization of the economy right away. So they want to sort of keep some sort of flexibility on the aim towards decarbonization. They're all signatories to the Paris Agreement. They want to undertake a decarbonization, but political environment is not conducive enough. So what we have seen and what we've suggested in conversations with them is that obviously a periodic review of the long-term strategy is extremely important and would be very helpful. Primarily because if in case ambition cannot be built into the strategy right away, there could be a moment in time, probably sometime in the future, in the next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, depending on the different political cycles, that you could reconsider that ambition on decarbonization or that particular goal on net zero emissions. It's important to think of how institutionally this increasing of ambition could be built over time, not necessarily only from an articulation point of view, but actually from an institutional point of view of revisiting the long-term strategy, revisiting some of the underlying assumptions, especially around costs, especially around technology availability, which are generally the biggest considerations for countries to not commit to decarbonization at that given moment in time. Depending on the jurisdiction and the mandate, as well as the societal consensus, because the societal consensus around net zero is extremely crucial. It is important to sort of, and obviously there are a lot of unknowns over a period of 30 years where you're projecting. So in order to sort of ensure that the long-term strategy is in line with the Paris Agreement, we have seen that a lot of countries at least indicate that they want to get to a net zero goal at a given point of time. And like I said, some countries choose to put a band out there. And in terms of the institutional framework, when you look at the different long-term strategies, you have the case of Japan, which has specifically said in 6 years we will review the long-term strategy, and it has sort of a 6-year review cycle. There's obviously a 5-year review cycle within the Paris Agreement, with 2023 being the next period of time where the global stocktake will happen. where ambition will be revisited. And then there are sort of a whole of government approach where, like in the UK, there is a climate change committee, or in Iceland, there's a presidential council that oversees the implementation as well as the underlying sort of science and the scientific basis for the long-term strategy in itself. It sort of creates a lot more space to actually improve on the long-term strategy and the underlying assumptions over a period of time, as well as creates bipartisan support for the long-term strategy in general. And lastly, there are some countries that are taking it much further. And like in the case of Sweden, New Zealand, and Chile, they have actually established a climate law. In the case of New Zealand, it's even more interesting that every law that New Zealand now passes will have to undergo some sort of a climate compatibility test in the parliament in order to see whether that particular law is in line with the New Zealand's long-term strategy and long-term climate goals. So it sort of takes the evaluation as well as the climate compatibility of the broader economy to another level by ensuring that every legal sort of provision in New Zealand has to be compatible with the goals that it has set for itself within the law as well as within its long-term strategy. So just coming back to the opportunities for Korea and the Green New Deal, obviously the Green New Deal is very central to country's ambition. And in this new sort of post-pandemic, well, nearly post-pandemic and economic crisis recovery world, climate measures obviously will need to be integrated much strongly in the larger recovery plans. There is obviously a great opportunity for job creation and infrastructure. And that particular idea of the new Green Deal can actually be one of the pillars for Korea's long-term strategy in itself, as well as include the idea of net zero emissions and transformation in a more cogent and more interactive and positive feedback way, where the Green Deal is part of the initial sort of phase for the long-term strategy, and the long-term strategy follows through some of the key objectives that have been identified in the new Green Deal, especially around job creation and sort of reviving the manufacturing or the manufacturing renaissance that Korea is aiming towards. So it would be extremely critical to sort of think of the Green Deal as well as long-term strategy as a whole. Maybe not in the same time series, but obviously as a sort of policy package that comes together and aims to decarbonize the Korean economy while maintaining as well as increasing the prosperity of the country at large. I'll leave it there. I'm very happy to answer any questions or queries that you might have. Thank you.
예, 대단히 감사합니다. 시타타 파타크 씨. 외국의 LEDS 수립 현황과 우리나라 한국의 LEDS 수립 방향에 대해서 조금 조언을 해주셨고요. 특히 넷제로를 어떻게 LEDS 반영해야 할 것인지에 대한 어떤 전략적인 접근 방법들을 몇 가지 좀 제안을 해주신 게 좀 아주 특이했습니다. 감사합니다. 지금 네 분의 외국 친구들께서 지금 발표를 해주셨고요. 이제 한국에는 세 분의 한국 패널리스트들이 준비하고 있습니다. 두 명의 환경부와 산업부의 그 담당 팀장님께서 와 계시고요. 한 분의 청년단체에서 오늘 그 패널리스트로 참여를 하고 있습니다. 세 분의 패널리스트는 아까 소개를 드렸기 때문에 지금 각 패널리스트로부터 간단한 발표와 그 다음에 코멘트 질의를 좀 같이 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 환경부의 고덕규 서기관이십니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 그 환경부에서 LEDS 담당하고 있는 고덕규 서기관입니다. 먼저 그 우리나라에서 LEDS를 수립하고 있는 현황에 대해서 먼저 간단하게 말씀드리고 오늘 발표하신 거에 대해서 좀 궁금한 거 몇 가지 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 저희 환경부에서 그 온실가스 종합정보센터에서 윤수원 팀장님 같이 자리하셨습니다. 해서 이제 구체적인 시나리오에 대해서 궁금한 것들은 이제 같이 팀장님께서 질문하시도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 지금 한국은 LEDS 준비를 작년부터 시작했습니다. 작년에 그 학계, 그 다음에 국책 연구기관, 시민사회, 산업계 같이 한 100여 명의 전문가가 모여서 그 5가지 시나리오를 도출하였고 그 5가지 시나리오와 함께 탄소 중립 방안도 이제 검토가 필요하다 이런 제안을 정부에 했습니다. 해서 정부는 올해부터 지금 정부 내 그 범정부 협의체를 구성해서 올해 연말에 수립을 목표로 LEDS를 준비하고 있습니다. 이와 함께 이제 그 대국민 여론조사, 그다음에 산업계 토론회, 그다음에 대국민 토론회를 해서 최종적으로 국민들의 의견을 듣고 정부의 그 2050 감축 목표와 전략에 대해서 최종적으로 결정할 계획입니다. 이상 이제 우리나라 LEDS 추진 상황에 대해서 간단히 말씀을 드렸고 좀 궁금한 것들에 대해서 몇 가지 여쭙도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 이제 그 특정 분께 질문을 드리는 경우도 있고 이제 좀 어떤 주제 같은 경우는 어떤 질문 같은 경우는 공통적인 질문도 있기 때문에 이 부분에 대해서 답변이 가능하신 분께서 좀 답변을 주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 첫 번째 질문은 지금 이제 국제적인 동향과 관련해서 이제 클라이밋 얼라이언스 같은 경우는 이제 현재 120개국이 참여하고 있는데 그 얼라이언스의 목표가 2050 탄소 중립입니다. 다만 이제 그 120개국 중에 실제로 이제 LEDS를 제출이 예정되는 국가가 어느 정도 되는지, 그 다음에 그 중에 실제 LEDS에서 2050 탄소 중립을 목표로 준비 중인 국가가 어느 정도 되는지 혹시나 아시는 바가 있으면 좀 질문을 부탁드리겠습니다. 두 번째 질문은 그 클라이밋 그 어널리스트 이제 우르슬레 푸엔테스님께 드리겠습니다. 우리나라의 이제 바람직한 2030 목표와 이제 2050 목표에 대해서 좀 말씀을 해주셨는데 그런 그 파리 협정에 대한 그 파리 협정 목표 달성을 위한 그런 큰 방향성에는 동감하는 바입니다. 다만 이제 현실적인 상황도 좀 볼 필요가 있을 텐데 EU나 그 다른 선진국의 경우는 이제 그 온실가스 배출 정점이 1990년 그러니까 그 지금으로부터 한 30년 전에 형성된 게 있습니다. 그 배출 정점을 달성하였습니다. 다만 이제 그에 반면 우리나라 같은 경우는 그 아직까지 온실가스가 증가하는 추세를 보이고 있습니다. 이런 그 나라의 상황의 차이가 있는데 우리나라도 이제 그 선진국, 그러니까 EU라든가 그런 감축 경로를 그대로 따라가는 게 과연 맞는 것인지, 그러니까 그 바람직한 방향성이면 분명하나 실질적으로 감축을 할 수 있는 그 기술적 조건이라든가 감축의 그 흐름이 감축의 이제 수준이 있을 텐데 그런 점도 그런 점을 고려하였을 때도 그런 그 2030년에 제안하신 목표가 우리나라가 그렇게 가야 된다고 생각하시는지 그 점에 대해서 좀 여쭙고 싶습니다. 그다음에 이제 그 프랑스나 이제 영국에서 이제 탄소 중립의 시나리오에 대해 말씀을 해주셨는데 이 부분에 대해서 이제 리차드 밀라 그 연구원님과 조셰프 아자르님께 좀 질문을 드리고 싶은 점이 그 우리나라 같은 경우는 사실 에너지 집약이 높은 산업 구조를 많이 갖고 있습니다. 철강도 그렇고 석유화학도 그렇고 시멘트도 그렇고 대표적으로 이 세 개 업종의 온실가스 배출량이 굉장히 높은 편인데 사실 아시겠지만 그 철강과 석유화학 같은 경우는 온실가스를 줄이기가 쉽지 않습니다. 다만 이제 EU의 시나리오라든가 프랑스나 영국의 시나리오를 보면은 이런 배출량이 높고 사실 배출하기가 쉽지 않은 업종에 대해서도 온실가스 배출 목표를 굉장히 높게 잡고 있는 걸 볼 수 있습니다. 그와 함께 그런 온실가스 감축 목표에도 불구하고 그 경제 성장률에 미치는 영향이라든가 고용에 미치는 영향이 EU의 LEDS 보고서라든가 그런 데를 확인하면은 그 부정적인 효과가 아니라 오히려 긍정적인 효과가 있다 이렇게 많이 기술되어 있는데 그 우리나라 이제 산업계에서는 좀 이렇게 주장하는 바가 많습니다. 그 EU에서 시나리오를 제시하는 예를 들어 석유화학 같은 업종의 경우는 CCU 기술이라든가 이제 파워텍스 기술 같은 경우 오히려 이거는 온실가스를 줄이는 효과보다는 온실가스를 오히려 늘어나게 되는 효과가 더 크다 이렇게 해서 일부 산업계에서는 주장하는 바도 있는데 이런 것들에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지, 그다음에 이제 EU의 시나리오에서 철강과 석유화학 같은 경우는 어떤 방식으로 줄일 예정이신지 이거에 대해 여쭙고 싶고, 마지막으로 그 석유화학이라든가 철강 같은 경우는 사실 그 어느 한 나라에서만 감축을 하게 되면은 사실 국가 간에 이제 형평성 문제가 발생할 수밖에 없을 겁니다. 그와 관련해서 EU 차원에서도 이제 뭐 탄소 국경세라든가 이런 그 정책을 도입을 검토하시는 걸로 알고 있는데, 철강이라든가 사실 석유화학 같은 부분은 그 제품의 소비재를 이제 전 세계가 공유하기 때문에 그 부분에 대해서는 전 세계적으로 좀 비슷한 흐름으로 가야 된다고 생각을 하고 있는데, 이와 관련해서 에너지 다배출 업종에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 그런 질문을 드리겠습니다. 이상입니다.
예, 감사합니다. 고덕규 소장님, 질문을 조금 많이 해주셨는데 그 발표자께서는 조금 노티스를 해놓고 계시고 세 분의 패널리스트 전체 그 짧은 발표를 좀 듣고 한꺼번에 조금 답변을 좀 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다. 다음은 산업부에서 나오신 성 팀장님이십니다.
예, 안녕하세요. 저는 산업부 온실가스 감축팀장입니다. 사실 조금 전에 그 환경부에서 고덕규 사회관님이 저희 산업에 대한 말씀을 많이 해주셔가지고 사실 좀 그 말씀이 좀 겹칠 수도 있을 것 같아요. 일단 아까 뭐 사실 저희도 뭐 비슷한 말씀이긴 한데 그 온실가스를 굉장히 적극적으로 감축해야 된다는 필요성에 대해서는 사실 모든 분들이 다 공감을 하고 있고 이것에 대해서 뭐 부인하는 분은 사실 없을 거라고 생각합니다. 다만 이제 저희처럼 그 에너지나 산업 같은 실무를 담당하는 입장에서는 현실적으로 이제 어려운 점들을 아무래도 더 고민할 수밖에 없고 그에 대한 해결 방안을 찾는 게 더 중요하다고 생각을 하고 있는데요. 아까 앞에서 이제 그 환경부에서도 말씀하셨듯이 저희는 지금 90년대 그 선진국들이 90년대부터 이미 그 온실가스 배출량이 줄고 있는 데 비해서 저희는 아직 배출 정점에 도달하지도 않았고 또 그 산업의 같은 경우는 경기 영향을 많이 받기 때문에 앞으로 뭐 경기가 좀 좋아지면은 사실 배출량이 뭐 증가할 가능성도 있어서 사실 언제가 지금 정점인지 일단 알 수가 없는 상황이고 또 저희는 지금 제조업 비중이 굉장히 높은 비중인 거를 다 잘 알고 계실 거라고 생각합니다. 지금 제조업이 28%여서 이제 유럽과 비교했을 때 유럽이 한 16.2% 정도 되잖아요. 그래서 제조업이 굉장히 높고 특히 이제 에너지 다소비 업종의 비중이 높다 보니까 그 최종 에너지 원단위가 이제 상대적으로 높은 이런 이제 구조적인 그 특징이 있고요. 또 사실 저희가 그 다소비 업종이 많긴 한데 워낙 글로벌 경쟁이 심하다 보니까 상당히 에너지 효율이 높은 편입니다. 그래서 저희가 지금 알기로는 상당히 높은 수준이어서 이제 산업에서는 에너지 효율을 추가로 감축할 수 있는 여력이 크지 않다. 이제 이런 그 말씀들을 하고 있어요. 그래서 현실적으로 급격하게 이제 감축을 하게 되면은 생산 기반을 아예 해외로 이전해야 된다든지 뭐 이런 일이 이제 생길 수 있다는 그런 우려들을 이제 산업에서 하고 계시고 또 한국의 이제 그 산업 구조로 봤을 때는 이제 철강이나 석유화학 같은 이런 소재 산업은 자동차나 조선 같은 그 수출품의 그 기초 소재를 공급하는 기간 산업이라는 또 이제 핵심적인 또 특징이 또 있죠. 그래서 유럽에서는 사실 그 이제 제조업 비중이 많이 줄어들고 첨단 산업으로 이제 산업 구조가 굉장히 크게 바뀌었기 때문에 이제 온실가스 감축이 이제 많이 그동안 되었고 또 그 경제 성장률도 많이 낮아진 상태였기 때문에 지금 디커플링까지 이제 실현을 하고 있는 상태인데 한국은 이렇게 지금 선진국들의 첨단 산업 구조 그리고 또 중국 같은 또 후발 국가들의 또 굉장히 빠른 그런 이제 추격 사이에 있는 이제 샌드위치 상태이거든요. 그러다 보니까 그 지금 산업 구조를 급격하게 바꾸는 게 그 글로벌 밸류체인 이 상황에서 쉽지 않다는 그런 이제 생각을 하게 되면서 에너지 다소비 업종이 크게 이제 온실가스를 감축할 수 있는 수단이 어떤 것들이 있는지 굉장히 이제 고민을 하고 있는 이제 그런 상황입니다. 그래서 산업 경쟁력을 유지하면서도 어떻게 하면 이렇게 에너지 다소비 업종들 온실가스를 크게 감축할 수 있을지 사실 방법론에 대한 고민이 많이 하고 있어요. 지금 아까 이제 다 발표해 주신 것들은 대부분 이제 방향성에 대한 얘기들이다 보니까 사실 다 이제 공감을 하는 내용들이고요. 다만 아까 이제 말씀하신 것 중에서 산업 부분에 구체적으로 이제 감축할 수 있는 수단들로 드신 게 에너지 효율, 뭐 CCS, 수소, 전기화, CCU, 뭐 바이오매스 이런 것들을 이제 언급을 하셨는데 저희 입장에서 본다면 사실 에너지 효율은 아까 말씀드렸듯이 굉장히 높은 수준이라고 생각을 하고 있고 CCS랑 CCU가 사실 한국이 굉장히 아직 갈 길이 먼 상태입니다. 사실 CCS 같은 경우에는 지금 100톤 주입에 실증에 성공한 그런 수준인데다가 지금 지역 수용성이 굉장히 낮아져가지고 실증을 더 이상 진행하지 못하고 있는 이런 좀 한계가 있고 CCU는 아예 상용화에 성공한 기술이 지금 없는 이런 좀 한계가 있고 또 바이오매스는 사실 저희가 바이오매스를 늘리게 된다면 이제 수입에 다 의존을 해야 되는 그런 한계가 있거든요. 또 수소도 사실 지금으로선 재생에너지로 생산하는 수소가 아닌 경우에는 다 이제 탄소가 나오는 거고 또 전기화가 또 이제 하나의 수단인데 전기화를 크게 늘리는 데 있어서 전기화로 인한 이제 이산화탄소 감축을 하려면 이제 재생에너지로 전기를 생산한다는 게 당연히 전제가 돼야 되는데 이제 한국은 유럽과 달리 그 전력망이 다른 나라하고 연계된 곳이 하나도 없습니다. 그러니까 유럽은 25개 국가가 다 이제 같은 전력망으로 연계되어 있어서 전력 수급이라든지 신재생의 변동성이라든지 이런 것들을 관리하는 데 그래도 용이한 측면이 있는데 이제 한국은 이제 그런 한계가 있다 보니까 망이 연결이 안 돼 있다 보니까 이제 수급이라든지 변동성 관리가 다른 유럽 이런 것보다는 상당히 쉽지 않은 그런 이제 구조적인 한계에 좀 있는 이제 그런 어려움이 있습니다. 그래서 이제 이런 현실적으로 이렇게 어려움이 있지만 어쨌든 탄소를 감축해야 된다는 방향성에 대해서는 다 이제 인식을 하고 있는 차원에서 제가 이제 드리고 싶은 질문은 아까 그 원론적인 차원에서의 수단이라든가 방향성에 대해서 이제 많이 말씀을 해주셨는데 이런 한국의 특수한 상황을 고려했을 때 산업에서 어떠한 수단과 방법으로 온실가스를 감축하는 것이 필요할 건지 사실 저희가 요즘 LEDS를 하면서 이제 감축 목표에 대한 얘기들을 많이 하다 보니까 업계에서는 이걸 규제로 인식을 하고 할 수 있다 없다 이런 논의들을 사실 많이 그쪽으로 치우치면서 사실 수단에 대한 논의들이 많이 이제 좀 되지 못하고 있는 그런 좀 안타까운 점도 있지만 그래서 이제 이미 이제 경험을 다 하신 그런 측면에서 본다면은 제가 지금 말씀드린 한국의 입장을 고려했을 때 한국에서 어떤 부분에 더 좀 집중을 하거나 아니면 정부에서 지원을 하거나 어떤 방식의 기업들의 노력을 통해서 좀 구체적으로 좀 필요한 부분이 뭐가 있을지 저는 좀 구체적인 조언 아니면 사례라든지 뭐 좀 이런 것들을 좀 있으시다면 좀 들려주시면 저희가 현실적으로 어떻게 해나갈지를 고민하는데 좀 도움이 될 것 같습니다. 이상입니다.
네, 감사합니다. 산업부 성 팀장님께서는 그 내용이 거의 환경부에서 고덕규 소장님께서 얘기하신 그 어려움, 특히 이제 제조업 비중이 가장 높은 그 선진국인 한국에서의 온실가스 감축의 어려움에 대해서 그리고 구체적인 옵션들이 뭐가 있을까, 구체적인 수단들이 뭐가 있을까에 대한 질문을 해주셨고요. 이따 한꺼번에 좀 답변 부탁드리겠습니다. 세 번째 패널리스트는 작년에 저탄소 발전 전략을 수립하기 위해서 저탄소 사회 비전 포럼을 운영을 했었는데 여기에 청년 분과위원으로 참석한 임재민 분과위원이 되겠습니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저탄소 사회 비전 포럼의 청년 분과위원으로 참여했던 임재민입니다. 저탄소 사회 비전 포럼의 이름이 비전입니다. 우리가 저탄소 사회로 가기 위해서 기후 생태계가 붕괴하지 않고 어떤 사회로 나갈지에 대해서 나가기 위해서 무엇을 해야 되는지에 대해서 비전을 세우고 그것을 위한 수단과 방법들을 도출하는 게 저희의 목적이었습니다. 그런데 앞에서 보시면 아시겠지만 사실은 현실적인 문제들이 있습니다. 지금까지 한국 사회가 왔던 산업적 경로와 그리고 지금까지 읽어왔던 여러 가지 여건들이 있기 때문에 사실 어려운 부분들이 많습니다. 사실 이런 상황 속에서 한국이 어떻게 기후위기를 대응하면서 새로운 산업으로 전환할 것이냐, 그 비전을 어떻게 수립할 것이냐에 대한 고민들을 아마 청년들에게 맡기기 위해서 청년 분과를 아마 이번에 처음으로 만들지 않았나 생각을 합니다. 이런 차원에서 청년 분과 위원들은 산업 분과 위원, 전환 분과 위원, 다양한 분과에 들어가기도 하고 또 총괄 분과 위원에 참여를 하면서 현실적 여건에서 어느 정도의 갭이 있는지 그리고 또 우리가 바꿔나갈 수 있는 것이 무엇인지 그리고 비전을 어떻게 수립해야 되는지에 대해서 다양하게 논의를 했습니다. 그런 차원에서 저희는 이제 초반부터 지속적으로 얘기를 했던 것은 저탄소 사회 비전 포럼 자체는 지구 생태계가 붕괴하지 않아야 된다. 과학에 기반해서 붕괴하지 않는 경로에 우리가 진입해야 된다. 두 번째로는 그리고 생태계만 붕괴하는 게 아니라 저희는 사실은 자초산업도 많습니다. 경제 산업도 붕괴하지 않는 방향으로 같이 가야 된다. 그래서 지구 생태가 붕괴하지 않으며 경제도 붕괴하지 않는 희망을 줄 수 있는 비전이 만들어져야 된다. 그 다음은 한국만 이런 온실가스 감축을 하고 기후변화 대응을 해서 온실가스 감축을 한다고 해서 기후변화에 대응을 할 수 없습니다. 그렇기 때문에 한국이 좋은 모델을 만들어서 글로벌 기후변화 대응과 지속가능한 새로운 모델을 제시할 수 있어야 된다. 그리고 이 비전이 세워졌다고 다 이루어질 수 있는 것이 아니기 때문에 이 비전을 수립하고 다양한 논의와 이행들, 수단과 방법들을 찾으면서 논의와 이행들을 촉진하는 비전들이 나와야 된다. 이런 차원에서 저탄소 사회 비전 포럼이 논의되었으면 좋겠다고 지속적으로 이제 참여를 하면서 의견을 냈었습니다. 그런 차원에서 이제 해외, 아까 말씀도 설명을 했지만 영국과 프랑스 해외 넷제로를 선언하는 국가들은 어떠한 관점으로 이 문제를 접근하고 있느냐, 그리고 이에 따라서 한국은 어떠한 관점으로 접근해야 되느냐에 대해서 저희가 내렸던 결론은, 첫 번째는 기후변화는 규제로 봐서는 안 된다. 이건 위기로 인식해야 된다. 위기와 비상은 우리가 그동안 중요하게 생각했던 것들을 잠시 내려놓고 그 위기를 위해서 힘을 모아야 되는 것이다. 그런 위기로 인식하고 대응해야 된다. 두 번째로는 단기적으로 임기응변식으로 대응해서는 안 된다. 그때그때 상황에 따라서 임기응변식을 대응하는 것이 아니라 장기적인 차원에서 근본적인 사회 시스템을 어떻게 전환해 나가야 되는지에 대해서 논의가 되어야 된다. 세 번째로는 비용적 접근으로 하게 되면 방어적으로 나갈 수밖에 없다. 장기적으로 우리가 이런 사회로 나아갔을 때 더 나은 편익과 더 나은 사회를 위한 비전이 있기 때문에 이를 투자의 관점으로 접근을 해야 된다. 네 번째로는 대규모 전환이라는 것을 기본적으로 인식하에 가야 된다. 산업구조, 온실가스 배출 많이 하는 거, 모든 걸 다 유지하면서 갈 수는 없다. 이 전환의 과정 속에서 생기는 여러 지역과 산업과 갈등 문제를 어떻게 해결할 수 있을지 종합적으로 접근하지 않으면 결국에는 또 다른 갈등으로 이어져서 아무것도 할 수 없다. 그리고 다섯 번째는 이 논의 자체가 특정 산업계, 특정 전문가, 특정 공무원들이 제한된 정보를 가지고 결정해서는 안 된다. 다양한 이해관계자가 정보를 공유하면서 이 문제를 함께 해결하고 사회적 자원들을 총동원할 수 있어야 된다. 근데 사실은 한국에서는 그런 정보들이 유럽과 미국과 다른 나라에 비해서 많이 공개되어 있지 않습니다. 사실은 특정 누군가에게만 공개되어 있고 연구도 특정 이해관계자들만 진행을 하고 있습니다. 그런 부분들에 있어서 한계가 있지 않나 생각합니다. 그리고 마지막으로는 2050년에만 넷제로 하면 기후변화 막아지냐? 막아질 수 없습니다. 과학자들은 5년 남았다, 7년 남았다고 얘기하고 있고 최근에 5년 남았다고 얘기하고 있습니다. 지금 당장 줄일 수 있는 감축 경로가 있어야 되고 탄소 예산에 기반해서 이 논의들이 이루어져야 된다라고 얘기했었습니다. 사실 그런 차원에서 다시 한번 저탄소 사회비전 포럼에 나온 검토안에 보면 과거에 비해 나아진 부분도 있지만 사실은 부족한 부분, 아쉬운 부분도 사실 많이 있습니다. 첫 번째로는 국가 비전에 탄소 중립이 처음으로 들어갔다. 한국 사회에서 탄소 중립이 처음으로 논의된 자리라는 것에 대해서는 굉장히 의의가 있었습니다. 그렇지만 현실적으로 탄소 중립을 하기 위한 방법론들이 무엇이 있는지, 어떻게 전환해야 되는지에 대해서 논의들이 너무 이루어지지 못했었습니다. 사회적 연구와 자본이 축적되어 있지 않았습니다. 그러다 보니까 검토가 충분히 이루어지지 못했고 5가지 검토안에는 들어가지 못했습니다. 아마 올해부터 논의가 촉발되면서 이런 검토안들을 충분히 만들어 나갈 수 있지 않을까 생각합니다. 여기 오신 해외, 영국, 유럽 다양한 국가들과 함께 협력하면서 그런 경쟁력 있는 수단들을 만들어 갔으면 좋겠습니다. 작년에 탄소 중립이 우리에게 꼭 필요한 것이다. 이것들을 검토안에 꼭 넣어서 시나리오들을 만들어 달라고 요구를 했었고, 또 누군가는 그거는 일부 청년들이 얘기하는 소리다. 일부의 의견을 가지고 국가 정책을 만들기 어렵다라는 의견도 들었었습니다. 근데 올해 선거가 이루어지고 다양한 논의들이 코로나 팬데믹 이후에 다양한 논의들이 이루어지면서 한국에서 새로운 변화들이 생기고 있습니다. 한국의 기초지자체가 228개인데요. 기초지자체장이 없는 3군데를 빼고 225개의 모든 기초지자체에서 기후위기 비상선언을 6월 5일 날 했습니다. 그리고 오늘 이 자리를 마련한 이수영 의원님을 비롯한 100여 명의 의원님들이 국회 기후위기 비상선언 결의안을 냈습니다. 그리고 모든 광역지자체가 탄소 중립을 선언했습니다. 사실상 밑바닥부터는 탄소 중립 선언을 위해서 다양한 의견들이 나오고 있습니다. 이제 단순히 방어적 입장이 아니라 정말 코로나 위기를 극복했던 것처럼 한국판 뉴딜로 새로 기후위기 대응을 하는 방법들을 찾아나가야 되는 시기라고 생각을 합니다. 이런 차원에서 저는 한국 사회에도 사실 얘기하고 싶은 분도 있고, 그리고 발표하신 분들에게도 또 질문 드리고 싶은 부분이 있습니다. 하나는 배출 제로 계획의 장점이라고 생각을 합니다. 사실 시나리오 검토하는데 명확합니다. 2050년에 우리가 배출 제로라고 한다면 그 뒤로부터 백캐스팅해서 지금 우리가 해야 되는 역할이 좀 명확해지는 부분들이 있습니다. 지금 배출해야 되는 탄소 예산, 지금 단기적으로 해야 되는 거, 중기적으로 해야 되는 거, 장기적으로 해야 되는 것들. 그리고 불필요한 부문 간 정치적 논쟁은 최소화할 수 있습니다. 산업이 얼마큼 줄일 것이냐, 건물이 얼마큼 줄일 것이냐, 서로 싸우는 것이 아니라 제로의 베이스에서 싸우면서 정말 기술적으로 안 되는 부분이 뭐냐, 현실적으로 어려운 부분들이 뭐냐, 그 갭들은 R&D를 통해서 할 수 있는 거냐, 아니면 시장적 경제적 기반을 만들어서 해결할 수 있는 것이냐에 대해서 조금 더 실현 가능한 논의들이 이루어질 수 있습니다. 그리고 제로에 가까워지기 위한 2050년에 우리의 비전 상을 그려놓고 지금부터 그것을 위한 가장 효율적이고 효과적인 시스템을 30년 동안 어떻게 만들어갈 것인지에 대해서 논의할 수 있습니다. 단기적인 관점이 아니라 장기적으로 시스템을 어떻게 바꿀지 얘기할 수 있습니다. 그리고 목표와 현실 사이에 명확한 갭을 확인할 수 있다는 장점이 있습니다. 그리고 또 기회의 영역도 있다고 생각을 합니다. 온실가스 배출하면 우리 다배출 산업이 많아서 한국 사회는 어려워질 거다, 자초 산업이 많아질 것이다. 사실 맞습니다. 위기입니다. 한국에 있는 청년들은 2050년에 기후위기로 여러 물리적 재난, 어려움 또 함께 겪을 것이지만 또 그동안 경제를 이끌어왔던 많은 산업들이 자초 산업이 되면서 자초 산업에 따른 경제 위기도 함께 겪을 것입니다. 기후변화 적응과 함께 경제적 위기까지 겪지 않도록 지금부터 이 산업에 대한 전환을 어떻게 해나가야 될지 실질적인 논의를 해야 된다고 생각을 합니다. 그런 의미에서 한국판 뉴딜, 그린 뉴딜은 이런 시작점이라고 생각을 합니다. 현재 아시아의 해상 풍력이 한 5기가가 있습니다. 2050년이 되면 613기가로 늘을 것이라고 얘기하고 있습니다. 태양광 규모 280기가인데 2050년까지 4,837기가로 늘을 거라는 이레나의 연구 보고서들이 있습니다. 다양한 기회들이 존재하고 이것이 한국이 선도적으로 지금 기후위기 대응을 하면서 다른 나라까지 온실가스 감축을 할 수 있도록 충분히 역할을 할 수 있고 역량이 있는 나라라고 저는 믿습니다. 이런 관점에서 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. UNFCC에 제출하는 LEDS는 법적 구속력이 있지 않습니다. 사실 그렇기 때문에 구속력이 있기 위해서는 국내 제도와 연결을 해야 됩니다. 그런 차원에서 영국도 프랑스도 법적 목표를 명확하게 했고 흔들리지 않고 여러 정치적 이해관계 흔들리지 않고 추진할 수 있도록 기반을 마련했습니다. 그런 부분들에서 어떻게 마련할 수 있는지 얘기를 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 두 번째로는 제도만이 아니라 시장과 기업들에게 명확한 시그널을 줘야 됩니다. 지금 이대로 가면 자초할 수 있다는 것, 그리고 이대로 가면 물리적 리스크에 따라서 기업이 가지고 있는 자산 가치도 떨어질 수 있다는 것. 아마 영국에서 이번에 영국 금융행위감독청에서 탄소 정보 공개를 의무적으로 상장 기업들에게 하도록 요구했습니다. 기업들이 기후변화에 어떻게 피해를 주고 있고 또 물리적 리스크에 얼마나 피해가 있는지 투자자들, 국민들 모두가 알 수 있도록 공시를 의무화하고 있습니다. 어떤 방식으로 시장에 시그널을 줘서 기업이 선도적으로 먼저 전환할 수 있도록 할 수 있는지에 대한 부분도 함께 이야기를 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 그리고 말씀드렸듯이 청년 참여 거버넌스가 이번에 처음이었습니다. 어떻게 이 문제에 대해서 책임 있게 청년들이 그리고 젊은 사람들이 함께 나갈 수 있는지도 함께 얘기해 주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 그리고 제조산업 탄소 누출 관련해서도 사실 얘기하고 싶었는데 앞에 고덕규 사무관 서기관님과 성신의 팀장님께서 말씀해 주셔서 같이 얘기해 주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
세 분 패널리스트의 간단한 발표와 그다음에 질문이 있었습니다. 크게 정리하자면 하나는 조금 기술적인 문제인데 이건 누가 좀 답변해 주실지 모르겠지만은 Climate Alliance에서 120개국이 탄소 중립을 선언을 했고, 근데 실제 LEDS를 제출한 국가는 몇 개 국가이고 그 안에 또는 예상되는 그 안에 국가 중에서 LEDS 제출될 국가들 중에서 2050년 탄소 중립 목표를 실제로 포함한 국가들 개수는 어느 정도 될 것인지 한번 예상이 되는지, 이건 아마 미스터 스타트 파탁이 조금 아실 건지 아니면 우슬라 푸엔테스 씨가 아실 건지 모르겠지만 좀 하나 부탁드리고요. 두 번째는 한국이 다른 EU 국가들에 비해서 또는 미국이나 일본에 비해서도 굉장히 높은 제조업 비중을 갖고 있습니다. 30% 이상이고요. 그다음에 에너지 다소비 업종을 굉장히 많이 갖고 있어서 산업 부분 에너지 사용 비중이 60% 이상입니다. 이거는 세계 탑인데 이런 상황에서 산업 구조를 전환시키는 어려움을 갖고 있는데 여기에 조금 더 구체적인 수단이라든가 방법을 조금 얘기를 해주셨으면 좀 좋겠다는 의견이 있었고요. 그리고 이제 세 번째는 저희 임재민 연구원이 얘기한 그 어떻게 법에 목표를 담을 수 있었을까? 그게 이제 합의가 물론 이제 정치적인 합의가 있어야 될 텐데 그런 부분들 또 기업들한테 시그널을 줄 수 있는 방법들과 특히 이제 프랑스 그 아자 씨에게 조금 질문 드리고 싶은데 거버넌스 스트럭처에 있어서 그런 컨설테이션에서 청년들을 어떻게 이제 참여시킬 수 있었는지 이런 부분들에 대해서 좀 답변을 각각 좀 주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 발표하신 순서대로 먼저 우슬라 푸엔테스 씨에게 좀 먼저 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yes, thank you very much. This was a very interesting debate and very good questions. Yes, I would like to address the question that related to this issue of comparability and how the pathway that I also showed specifically how that takes into account the specific current situation and starting point in South Korea in terms of the contribution of sectors, in terms of the current growth, and in terms of the structure of the economy and of industry, and the large share of energy intensive industry. That is of course a very important a question to consider, and that is why this is such an important element that we are seeing, I think, in the development of strategies, that the importance of developing analysis and developing a range of scenarios and discussing that with stakeholders. I've heard, and that was very interesting to hear from the UK and France, where these processes have been developed. I'm hearing that this is also happening in Korea, and actually that was also part of the process in Germany and in many other countries. So the pathway that that I showed, that was building on a range of global pathway, least cost pathways, and downscaled to the South Korean economy, that has the link to a global least cost pathway, but also takes into account the situation in South Korea. But of course, just even a range of these pathways doesn't replace the development of national scenarios and the link to this national discussion. In terms of the comparability, looking into the results, yes, so what I showed as a pathway that would lead to a reduction of 59%, up to 59% below 2017 levels, that is actually a pathway that would then bring emissions in South Korea to about the same level as in 1990, whereas similar pathways that we have developed for other countries where emissions have peaked already earlier and have been reducing historically, such as for the European Union and also for Germany, as I showed there, these Paris Agreement consistent mitigation pathways lead to reductions, to very large reductions compared to 1990, like above 70%, or for Germany, For the EU, we have also developed pathways, initial indicative pathways, also in the order of 70% reduction. So there the message is also the need to enhance compared to current targets. But of course, these pathways in that sense also take into account the historic development. In terms of the implications and I guess the feasibility, both in the technical but also in the economic sense, looking into the sectors, that's of course a very important consideration. And I do know also from my background the context of the discussion in Germany, where where there's also quite a large energy-intensive and export-oriented industry. So the discussion about this long-term strategy and the long-term target was a very and is a very intensive discussion with stakeholders, including the industry sector, and the German industry association, an umbrella organization of different industry associations, has sparked by this through the discussion that started with the long-term strategy, has developed its own scenarios and has come to the conclusion that this is feasible, but that it will involve a whole of the economy approach and also a whole of a society sort of support for such a strategy. So it's really every sector that has to contribute at different paces. And the other point I would like to make is that, and I think that was also highlighted by the other presenters, that much of what is possible now is possible now at lower costs than what was possible maybe 10 or 20 years ago, because of the dynamic development of technology. And if we look into end-use sectors, in particular also industry, the opportunities that we have through the decarbonization of the power sector, the decarbonization of electricity generation, and through this and the what we also call coupling of sectors, so the decarbonization of end-use sectors through electrification, either directly or indirectly through production of hydrogen from renewable electricity or synthetic fuels. This opens up opportunities for a much more transformational development and decarbonization than what we have seen in the past. So in that sense, maybe one perspective is that that the past is not necessarily, and what we see in terms of emission reduction rates in other countries in the past is not necessarily what teaches us what is possible for the future. But certainly it's important to have a closer look into sectors in discussion with stakeholders, to look into these opportunities, and also looking into opportunities for international collaboration and exchange. For example, when we look into these hard to abate sectors, also under you mentioned steel, and cement is another sector, or freight transport and aviation. So international collaboration and exchange can be an avenue, and also regional cooperation. I understand that, for example, South Korea has been developing a hydrogen strategy and looking into importing green hydrogen from countries with higher potential for renewable energy. For example, Australia is also one of these emerging opportunities that are developing through cost reductions in electrolyzers and renewable energy. Yeah, so with this, maybe other questions might want to be addressed by other panelists. Thank you.
지금 한 50분 이상이 온라인으로 지금 참석을 하고 계신데 혹시 질의사항이 있으시면은 Q&A에 적어주시면 제가 대신해서 그 발표자나 패널리스트에게 질의를 하도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 리차드 밀러 씨가 조금 영국 입장에서 좀 질문에 좀 답변을 해주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Yes, absolutely, and thanks for the questions. I think they're all really, really relevant questions and really interesting. And if I can, I'll try and offer some thoughts on the industry questions. I think probably the first thing to say is that we absolutely don't have all the answers to this either, and there's lots of things we can learn from Korea about this. But I think some of the perspectives I think we've thought are important, and I think it will be important to develop further in the UK's industrial decarbonisation journey is really the principle of decarbonisation, not offshoring. I think that's what we're really keen to see, where we do have the energy intensive sectors in the UK, which obviously aren't to the same proportion as they might be in Korea, but where they do exist, we want to decarbonise those and not see them go offshore, because that's not going to be good for a number of things, for the economy, for those communities that are, it's a really important job creator, for instance. So yeah, I think there's still a long way to go on developing the industrial policy that's going to be needed to do that in the UK. But I think we can see some of the trajectory of that. I think we see that taxpayer can have a role in the near term in helping to avoid those some of those competitiveness issues where industries are trade exposed. But I think as we look further ahead, we probably anticipate that there's going to be a need to, in the UK at least, to transition away from that model more to some other mechanisms that might prevent offshoring and ensure competitiveness. So for instance, those might be product standards to develop low carbon markets in the UK for those products to prevent them being undercut by products from overseas, but also exploring things like border carbon adjustments to do that as well. And yes, and I think that one of the useful things about net zero is that it does highlight in industry how important that fuel switching role is going to be, because obviously efficiency is going to be important in helping manage the scale of the challenge of industry. But fundamentally, when we're talking about net zero, we are going to need to address those carbon fuels. So I think, as you rightly highlighted in some of your comments there, that making sure that hydrogen is available and is genuinely low carbon will be really key for that industrial challenge, and it's something that the UK is going to have to grapple with as well over the decades. And also I think it speaks in some extent to the importance of getting the timing right with industry. No one wants to see stranded industries or scrapped assets, and when we look ahead to that turnover timescale of some of these really large plants, long lifetimes, I think making sure that we get the right support in place, and also the options available in time for the next round of capital investment, really, that's going to, I think in many cases, be the capital that will be around in 2050. So yeah, those are absolutely some of the things that are on our radar for the UK challenge. We absolutely don't have all the answers to that at the moment, but yeah, we'll certainly be pushing the government here to really think about those questions and make sure that we can try and make sure that we don't just offshore our industry, which as you highlighted wouldn't be good for global emissions. And maybe if I quickly speak to just some of the other points while I have a chance. I think someone was talking about the value of the 2050 net zero target, and I think one of the big values that's come out from it in the UK is that we know that we need to get to net zero at some point to stop temperatures going up. It's just what will have to happen. And I think one of the really useful things that a net zero target nationally has brought is to move away from the discussion a bit of who's in the remaining 20% of emissions, what sectors is that, what businesses are in that 20%, which was the discussion a lot when we had the 80% target. Now with net zero, it's clear that every sector needs to be aiming to get there somehow, and I think that shifts the discussion a bit to really think about what are those options that can get you to zero, and when can you do those, and to what extent, if you do have unavoidable emissions, how might you compensate those from removals. And I think the UK Act having that long-term target definitely helps with that. Some of the bits I think in the UK Act that are also useful is the lead time that comes with the budget setting. So, you know, we're looking now at the sixth carbon budget for the UK in the mid-2030s, so about a 12-year lead time, and having that time where it's locked in advance gives that certainty in the near term for that can allow the businesses to make that capital investment decision. Obviously, that needs a full policy program from government to actually deliver on those budgets. But having an ability to signal that target in advance and to make it quite difficult for that target to be changed once it's been legislated, I think is important to providing business confidence in sectors like industry that they can make the investments that are going to be needed, and they won't be caught out by changes in government policy further down the line. Thank you.
다음으로는 조세프 아자 씨께서 좀 프랑스 입장에서 또는 프랑스의 경험을 통해서 지금 제기됐던 질문들에 대해서 좀 답변을 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. Quickly about the question about the long-term strategies and whether they were notified to UNFCCC, I just wanted to mention that we are in the process of translating our updated long-term strategy in English, and soon we will submit it to the UNFCCC, and so hopefully you will have the chance also to look at it more in detail if you'd like. And we do believe that these long-term strategies are key. They are linked with NDCs, as we need to have the targets and the strategy which is consistent with these targets. So for us, it really goes together as a whole, and this is very important for us. Coming to the point of the realism, is it realistic to have very ambitious targets? So of course there are very important challenges, but what we see actually, if we look at what the IPCC says, and what maybe we should ask ourselves is it realistic not to be carbon neutral soon enough? And is it realistic to live in a world where we haven't succeeded in tackling climate change? And IPCC science tends to show that it's not realistic, actually. And so maybe the right question to ask ourselves is how we can succeed this collectively as a national society and international societies. And if you look at the example of France, when we stated that we wanted to be climate neutral in 2017, back then it was a political decision. We hadn't run any modeling or any scenario yet, but we thought that this was the right thing to do for developed countries, given what the IPCC said. And then we went through all the modeling and consultation process to figure out how we can do this. What are the conditions? What are the orientations that we need to pursue in order to reach this objective? And this really shifted the debate between the different actors. They were not anymore saying, arguing about where we should go, but how we should get there. And this was very interesting in our process. And about this process, it's also very important to have a kind of transparency and debate within the different stakeholders, as we learned a lot from this debate. And as I said, all this work bringing together these different actors is still going on somehow. There is still a living debate about all these issues. Some stakeholders are designing their own scenarios. Some of them are not really in line with ours. So it creates a kind of debate. And as I said, it's a cycle. And then in 5 years, we can learn from all of this process and make a strategy that is even more realistic. So this is very important in the government's framework. About the industry more specifically, of course, it's a big challenge. And as I showed, our residual emissions in 2050 mostly come from the industrial sector, as industrial processes are very hard to decarbonize from some of them. And we don't see that we might have available technologies to deal with this soon enough. But still, there are ways to cut down emission in very significant way. We talked about electrification, of course, as the electricity sector has the possibility to be decarbonized through renewable energies, for example. It's also very important to invest on R&D to develop new processes and including electrifying some processes that today happen through fossil fuels. We mentioned CCS as well. As I said, we don't rely heavily on CCS, and we don't see, for France at least, that the CCS should be a way to continue using fossil fuels, but instead CCS should only be a way to compensate the residual emissions in 2050. But still, there is a need for R&D and for support, some pilot projects in CCS if we want to tackle the challenges in the industrial sector. And also, it's very important to give the right signals to the industrial sector, and this might be done first through carbon price, which is a very important tool, which we have in our national law, but also at the European level with the EU ETS. And as you know, this has proven to be very effective to giving the right signals. And we are still working on this scheme to make it even more robust and to provide more long-term signals for the different actors. But it's proven to be very efficient in the last years. And we got some very good results with the ETS. I also wanted to remind in my presentation the point about circular economy, as it's not just business as usual and then decarbonization. When we made our first strategies and even our first policies some years ago, and it's the case for many countries and actors, it was mostly a technological-based approach. We looked at energy efficiency, renewable energies, and so how we can put them together to reach our objectives. But actually, it doesn't work like this. And as I mentioned, the way that people live, the way that we are organized collectively as a society is very important. And the UK showed example about the measures that implies behavioral changes. And actually, it's an important share of this. So we also need to think about the way that we buy goods, that we consume, and circular economy in this aspect is also key and should be included in these reflections. And finally, I wanted to mention that there will be a need for support measures as well, because the transition, it's obvious that it will not go without winners and losers. So some sectors will have to disappear in the transition. This is obvious, and we need to take this into account starting now. In order to support these sectors, to support the people that work in these sectors, so they can find another jobs in another sectors. But it's also important to see that the transition will also create a lot of opportunities that will require a lot of research and development, a lot of new technologies and new investments. So this has to be taken into account in order to support this transition and to make sure that this transition is fair for households and for companies. Otherwise, we will have strong oppositions and issues that will make it impossible to reach. Finally, the last point was about how we translate this into the law and give the right signals. I think it all comes to climate governance. So it's very country specific. There is no good answers to general answer to this question. But it's a combination of different things. Many countries have come up with independent expert bodies, such as the CCC in the UK. Of course, we translated a lot of the milestones and the objectives in our law, which is also a very strong signal given to the whole society. But it also has a lot to do with how the national level and the subnational level can interact, can put their strategies together in a consistent way, so that it doesn't remain just a strategy on a paper, but that really everybody is taking part on meeting these objectives. Yes, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
스타트업 바탁씨, 혹시 클라이밋 얼라이언스에 소속된 120개 국가 중에서 실제 LEDS에 2050년 넷제로를 포함할 것으로 예상되는 국가들의 수가 얼마인지 혹시 추측이라도 해주실 수 있으시겠습니까?
Sure. So around in the 120 countries, like I said, there are a lot of LDCs, least developed countries, as well as the small island states. They are preparing their long-term strategies. They haven't submitted it, and they're likely to submit it only after COP26 because they started last year. So it might be between COP26 to the global stocktake that happens in 2023, and I'm talking very specifically the UNFCCC calendar. But amongst the OECD countries, which are the sort of more advanced economies in the world, around 35 of them are already, sorry, let me just get exactly the number. 31 are doing their long-term strategies with net zero as part of their long-term strategies in it, amongst the 37 OECD countries that are there. So I think for Korea's sort of global international context, the OECD fits much more than the 150 countries, which includes a lot of the LDCs and AOSs that have very limited capacity, and we need to build the capacity for them to undertake the long-term strategy first, and then get to the point where they actually do their long-term strategy and submit it. But their political intent on net zero is there. So not to say that they're not interested, it's just that they don't have the capacity to do the sort of modeling or the sort of consultations as well as discussions that are needed for the long-term strategy. So I would assume by if you give it a bit more time beyond COP26, I would think at least 75 to 80% of these 150 countries will submit their long-term strategy because they are in preparation. They might not submit it at COP26 in itself, but they'll definitely do it between COP26 and the global stocktake, which is in 2023. And just to sort of quickly add a few more things, comments, I think an overarching comment that I had was, because climate change is sort of an inevitability, the long-term strategy needs to be thought about as being prepared for that inevitability. Whether you prepare for it with an opportunities optics or whether you prepare for it from a risk mitigation optic, that's up to the country in itself. But I don't think we can debate the inevitability of climate change anymore. I think we are past that point of the debate. And just specifically on industries, I think because the Korean industries are extremely export oriented and Korea as a country is highly good on innovation, I would think looking at the peers where you're exporting the goods to would make a huge difference. And because a lot of the Asian economies are starting to pivot towards decarbonization, the industries in Korea will also need to switch eventually towards supplying for that demand that is rapidly changing. I would say that specifically on ideas around industry, you should maybe look deeper into the model that Sweden and Norway sort of used, where in the long-term strategy, they basically asked the industries to develop their roadmap toward decarbonization instead of the government telling them that this is what you need to do. That allowed the industry a lot more flexibility to actually identify where exactly are the areas of decarbonization, or where exactly is the sort of precision in terms of problem that they might have towards decarbonization, whether it's on specific technology, whether it's on specific sort of regulation, or very, very specific, not a generic sort of a problem around we cannot decarbonize because we just cannot, but being very specific about these are the sort of problems. This is where the government could help. I think that bottom-up sort of industry roadmaps that those countries have done could be very useful in the Korean context, especially because the industry requires a lot of help. Just finally, the last point that I wanted to make was on the size and the grid that was talked about. I think there are many countries in Southeast Asia, and including Singapore, that are smaller in size, very good on innovation, but unfortunately decarbonization requires a bit more of land space. So I think one of the elements in which a lot of countries are addressing this is through international cooperation. And because there is a need in Korea and nobody expects Korea to do decarbonization completely on its own, I think the idea of international cooperation and the whole idea of the Paris Agreement is to sort of highlight these areas where Korea could use international help to actually decarbonize, whether it's on grid connectivity or whether it's on specific sort of competitiveness regulations that need to be harmonized across countries in order to sort of ensure that the industries are not negatively impacted. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
원래 오늘 그 토론회가 그 6시 한국 시간으로 6시 반까지 계획되어 있는데 지금 5분밖에 남지 않았습니다. 그 외국 친구들께서 양해해 주신다면, 그다음에 여기에 계신 한국 분들도 양해해 주신다면 한 5분에서 10분 정도 조금 더 시간을 좀 연장해서, 오늘 너무 좋은 토론과 답변이 있기 때문에 연장했으면 조금 하고요. 우선 7분의 그 온라인 질문이 있는데 그 전에 먼저 여기 그 LEDS를 수립하는 기술적인 지원을 하고 있는 한국의 온실가스 종합정보센터에 윤소은 팀장님이 나와 계셨기 때문에 여기 현장에 계시기 때문에 여기 좀 질문을 받고 그 다음에 다시 온라인 질문을 좀 제가 대신 드리도록 하겠습니다.
예, 안녕하십니까. 온실가스 종합정보센터 윤소은 팀장입니다. 예, 좋은 발표 감사드립니다. 저는 그 영국과 지금 독일, 프랑스에 구체적으로 LEDS를 작성을 하셨던 그 전문가분이 계시기 때문에 그분들께 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다. 특별히 뭐 다양한 기술적인 질문들이 있는데 시간 관계상 비용 관련된 분석 결과에 대한 얘기들을 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다. 한국에선 지금 그 넷제로를 포함해서 6가지의 시나리오 중에 지금 어떠한 시나리오를 선택할 것인지에 대한 논의를 지금 진행 중에 있습니다. 그래서 그 진행을 하는 데 있어서의 어떠한 시나리오를 선정하는 것이 적절한지의 판단 근거로서 비용적인 측면 어느 정도의 비용이 들 것인지에 대한 그 분석 결과를 요청하는 사례가 많아지고 있습니다. 그래서 비용에 대한 분석을 지금 현재 진행 중에 있는데요. 하지만 이제 비용이라는 것, 특히나 50년까지의 장기적인 비용이라는 것은 그 불확실성이라든가 그다음에 어떤 모형을 선정하느냐에 따라서 그 레인지가 굉장히 천차만별로 나올 수 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 이에 그 비용을 제시하는 것 또한 굉장히 저희로서는 굉장히 조심스러울 수밖에 없는데, 지금 영국과 지금 프랑스의 사례에서 각각 그 비용 관련된 분석 결과를 제시해 주셨습니다. 그래서 이러한 비용이 공통적으로 저희가 판단했을 땐, 제가 개인적으로 판단했을 때는 부가적인 시나리오나 그 감축 목표를 결정하는 데 있어서는 부가적인 참고 자료로 쓰일 수 있다라는 판단을 하는데, 각 영국과 독일에서는 이러한 그 비용에 대한 결과물이 어떻게 활용이 됐는지, 어떻게 영향을 그 결정을 하는 데 있어서 목표 결정을 하는 데 도움이 되었는지, 참고가 어느 정도 되었는지 궁금합니다. 그다음에 영국에서 그 발표 자료 17페이지에서도 사실상 그 2050년에 90년 대비 80% 감축했던 연간 비용이 지금 현재 넷제로를 그 하는데 드는 비용과 거의 동일하다. 그리고 앞으로의 기술 확산이 현재 예상보다 빨리 진행이 된다면 비용이 낮아질 수 있다라는 예상을 한다는 설명을 들었습니다. 그래서 제가 예측하기로는 이러한 비용들은 사실상 2050년에 감축 넷제로를 달성하기 위해서 드는 자원 비용이라고 판단이 드는데요. 이러한 자원 비용을 산정하실 때 실제적인 투자나 실제적인 에너지 비용, 특히나 뭐 관리 비용, 이런 것들이 충분히 파악이 됐을 것이라 판단이 되는데, 예를 들면 재생에너지 같은 경우에 개ton 유용성을 많이 요구를 합니다. 그렇기 때문에 실제적으로 저희가 LCO를 평가하는 데 있어서의 발전 단가라든가 이거 외에도 사실 유연성 자원에 대한 비용이 굉장히 많이 들 수 있습니다. 또 한국의 경우에는 뭐 다른 나라도 마찬가지겠지만 추가적인 전환 부분에 뭐 스마트 그리드나 뭐 이런 교통 부분의 수소전 기차나 충전소 등의 인프라 비용도 굉장히 많이 들 것이라 예상이 됩니다. 그래서 이런 자원 비용을 산정하실 때 이런 인프라 관련된 비용도 포함된 가격인지 궁금합니다. 또한 또 한 가지가 기본적으로 그 감축 실현이 되면 축소된 화석연료 수입에 따른 비용이 어쨌든 자국 내 산업에 또 재투자가 될 수 있는 기회비용으로 쓸 수 있고 저탄소 산업의 부양에 추가적으로 발생할 수 있을 것이라는 예상이 되는데 이러한 그 자원 비용의 결과물에 이러한 추가적이면서 또 부가적인 잠재적 이용이 고려되었는지 좀 궁금합니다. 추가적으로 질문이 좀 있는데 시간 관계상 이 정도로 하고 만약에 기회가 되면 전달을 하도록 하겠습니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 시가스 종합정보센터 윤소은 팀장님께서는 비용 관련해서 모델링할 때 어떻게 이제 반영을 하셨는지 크게 이렇게 질문을 해주신 것 같고요. 온라인으로는 이제 몇 가지 질문이 들어왔는데 크게 이제 세 가지입니다. 하나는 그 프랑스 이자르 씨께 좀 질문하는 것들인데요. 하나는 2050년에 프랑스가 이제 원전 비중이 굉장히 높은데 2050년 지금 현재 넷제로 그 시나리오에서의 원전 비중은 어떻게 되는지 이제 질문을 하고 계시고요. 그리고 또 같은 이제 아자르 씨한테 질문이 또 같이 간다 그러면은 2050년 넷제로에 있어서 시민들하고 기업들 반대가 있었을 것 같은데 어떻게 이런 시민들과 기업들의 반대를 설득을 해가면서 의견 수렴을 했는지 여기에 좀 질문을 또 아까 물론 중간중간 얘기를 해주신 것 같긴 하지만 조금 추가해서 그 말씀을 해주시면 감사하겠고요. 또 이제 산업부하고 환경부 여기 한국의 패널리스트에 대한 질문인데 이 부분은 누가 답변하실지 모르겠지만 철강 대책이 있는 건지 철강 부분의 온실가스 감축 정책을 어떻게 생각을 하고 계신 건지 그 산업부나 환경부의 패널 중 한 분께서 좀 답변을 해주시면 좋겠고요. 그 다음에 이 부분은 누가 답변을 해주실지 모르겠지만 아마 제가 그냥 우줄라 부엔토스 씨께 좀 부탁을 드리면은 여러 가지 지금 국제적으로 뭐 오늘 프랑스와 영국도 있고 다른 클라이밋 어널리틱스에서 여러 가지 발표한 자료들 보면은 CCS의 가능성에 대해서 조금 굉장히 좀 낮게 잠재량에 대해서 평가를 하고 있는데 이 부분에 대해서 CCS의 기술적인 가능성, 미래의 가능성에 대해서 특히 이제 스토리지 문제가 많이 제기되고 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 이 부분에 대해서 어떻게 평가를 하시는지 좀 질문을 드려보겠습니다. 우선 우줄라 부엔토스 씨께 좀 간단하게 시간이 많지 않기 때문에 간단하게 좀 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you. Yes, feasibility of CCS. CCS is often an option that we still find applied in many of the models, also of these integrated assessment model pathways that that I showed, also linked to fossil fuels. However, actually, currently, CCS in combination with fossil fuels in power generation only exists, as of today, actually only exists in one power plant on the whole planet. The other one has been shut down just recently. So that shows, and I would fully support that CCS is not a viable option in conjunction with fossil fuel to continue using fossil fuels for power generation, because it is too costly compared to the other technologies where costs are falling, whereas with CCS costs are not falling, and there are technical challenges in terms of transport, in terms of storage, in terms of long-term safe storage. So where CCS could be still one of the options is in some of the sectors, hard to abate sectors, possibly, for example, cement and some of the industry sectors. But even there, more and more options are emerging that would not rely on CCS. For example, steel direct reduction with hydrogen, even cement with either alternative materials or reduced clinker, or modern cement material. So there's a lot of research and development ongoing, but I think certainly no future in the power sector. with fossil fuels.
네, 감사합니다. 그 아자르 씨, 그 2050년 프랑스의 넷제로 시나리오에서 원전 비중과 그리고 시민들의 어떤 반대 또는 그 넷제로의 의견 수렴하는 과정들에 대해서 간단하게 좀 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you. And if you may, I will just answer very quickly the question about cost assessments that was raised also, as it's quite interesting. So yeah, we performed some economic analysis on our scenario, but it's important to note that it was not the main reference point for our work. And actually, we run sectoral models that were more focusing on technologies that would be available, their development, the energy balances, etc. But the cost point of view was not the main entry point, and we looked at the cost most mainly at the end of the process to see, okay, this trajectory, what it implies in terms of investment, of GDP, etc. But as I said, it was first of all a political objective to be carbon neutral, and then we looked at how we can achieve it. And at the end, we looked at what it would cost and what it would imply. But as you said, there are huge uncertainties linked to costs. And so we believe that we should keep in mind that these are order of magnitudes, and we should not make it the only point for decision making. About the share of nuclear, so obviously we have a high share of nuclear nowadays in France. In our long-term scenario, we don't specify how the electricity mix evolves after 2030. We just say that it needs to be fully decarbonized. So it may include a share of nuclear energy and a share of renewable. And we now have some studies going on in order to make decision in the coming year about the share of nuclear and the development of new nuclear plants or not. And so these are still decisions to come, but we are sure that in 2050, all electricity must be decarbonized. This is a necessary condition. The point about contestations, actually, we didn't have real contestations on the objective itself once it was stated, and this is important to note. And on the contrary, there are growing expectations from the civil society to take ambitious climate action, actually, and raising concerns about the effect of climate change that everybody is experiencing nowadays. The industries themselves are now aware of this civil consciousness, and they cannot just say, we don't want to make any effort because people would not accept this. So all in all, everybody kind of agreed with the overall objective, but everybody is really paying attention to the fact that this must be fair, this must be done in an organized way and in a way that is fair for the different economic sectors, the different people, and that nobody should be left aside. And this is how we can sort of bring everybody together in this kind of objective and trajectory. Thank you very much.
저기 비용 문제에 대해서 영국 모델링 과정 중에서 좀 저희들한테 설명을 해주실 부분이 있을 것 같아서 좀 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yeah, so on the cost question, I think I'd echo a lot of what just the previous speaker there said about how we approached costs. Again, it wasn't the primary entry point to us for our analysis, but clearly it's an important one as well. And we did try and capture all the different costs that exist across the economy, including those costs in the power sector of having more variable renewables and the systems costs that come with balancing out that. And actually, when we look at it, there are some sectors of the economy that, compared to a climate, a high carbon world with no climate action, there's going to be just cheaper costs. So for surface transport, it's going to be one where it's just going to be cheaper, we think, to drive an electric car across its lifetime in the UK from the mid-2030s. So actually, there'll be a net saving there. And this distribution of costs is slightly distributed in different sectors across the economy. Actually, a lot of that total, the 1 to 2% we're talking about, is potentially held in the costs of those removals for actually removing carbon from the atmosphere, where we can't avoid avoid those emissions reductions. But I think it is worth also saying that, you know, there's probably, we expect there to be higher investments in the UK to deliver this pathway. It's clearly going to require a lot of investment to do it, and particularly more CapEx expenditure. We might expect an extra 1% of investment we estimated in 2050 to be delivering this pathway. And probably that balance of expenditure on the capital versus the operational expenditure on the fuel might shift substantially in the UK. So we do expect in a much more renewable power sector, for instance, and reducing use of fossil fuels across the economy, that sort of operational expenditure might come significantly down, but more of the costs, investments might be borne in the capital side. So yeah, managing that transition is going to be an important one for us.
대한 질문도 하나 있었는데요. 특히 탈탄소가 어려운 철강 부분 대책이 한국의 대책은 무엇인지에 대한 질문이 있었고요. 여기에 대해서는 산업부의 성신혜 팀장님께 좀 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 아까 그 질문을 하신 분께서 이제 두 가지를 제가 아까 온라인 글 보니까 이제 발전소가 이미 이제 뭐 6차 계획 때부터 많이 건설이 돼가지고 이제 좀 줄이기 어렵지 않냐, 뭐 이런 질문도 같이 해서 두 가지 말씀드리면, 먼저 이제 발전 설비 2011년에 이제 저희 대정전이 이제 발생을, 뭐 블랙아웃이라고 이제 정전이 발생하면서 그 직후에 사실 전력 수급 안정에 굉장히 많은 이제 방점을 두면서 발전소를 많이 이제 그 건설 계획이 많이 들어갔던 건 사실이고요. 당시에 이제 수급과 동시에 이제 전기 요금을 안정적으로 관리하는 그런 이제 과제 때문에 그때 이제 화력 발전소가 많이 이제 계획이 들어갔었는데, 사실 지금은 저희가 이제 많이 그 재생에너지를 좀 많이 확대하는 방향으로 지금 이렇게 많이 전환이 돼서, 이게 아까 말씀드렸듯이 수급과 요금과 이런 것들을 복합적으로 고려하다 보니까 아주 급격하게 전환 부분에서 그 믹스를 바꾸는데 한계가 있는 것은 이제 사실이고요. 다만 저희가 그 과정에서 어쨌든 최대한 저탄소 전력을 늘리는데 최대한 노력을 하고 있고요. 철강에 대한 대책이 있는지를 말씀하신, 사실 저희가 지금 업계도 사실 아까 앞에서 말씀드렸듯이 철강이 그렇게 온실가스를 크게 감축할 수 있는 여력이 많지는 않다고들 저희가 생각들을 하고 있는데, 지금 이제 고민하고 있는 것은 그 철강에 들어가는 유연탄을 이제 수소로 대체하는 수소 환원 기술 개발이라든가 이런 것들을 지금 집중적으로 하고 있고요. 이걸 좀 더 확대할 수 있는 방안을 고민하고 있다고 생각하는 것을 알고 있습니다. 다만 뭐 지금 어떤 철강에서 이렇게 철강 업계 대책이라 이렇게 나와서 뭐 준비되고 있고 구체적으로 이런 정도까지는 아닌 것으로 알고 있는데, 업계들 또 저희도 지금 충분히 심각하게 이제 고민을 하고 있다, 이런 점을 좀 말씀드리고 싶고요. 또 사실 산업 쪽에서 이제 전기화가 어떻게 보면 또 하나의 뭐 그 저탄소로 가는 방안이 될 수가 있는데, 아까 제가 앞서서 말씀드렸듯이 신재생이 전제가 되는 전기화가 이제 저탄소로 가는 거기 때문에 그 산업 쪽에서의 한국에서의 그 이제 전기화 속도는 어떻게 보면 신재생 보급 속도하고 좀 보급 속도를 고려하면서 가야 되지 않나, 저는 이제 그렇게 생각합니다. 그래서 이런 부분까지 같이 좀 고려를 해서 산업계에서도 사실 많은 지금 고민을 하고 있는 뭐 그런 상황이라는 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다.
예, 감사합니다. 지금 벌써 10분이 넘어갔고요. 그래서 오늘 저희 토론회는 이걸로 마치도록 하겠습니다. 다시 한번 외국에서 참석해 주신 네 분의 발제자 여러분, 여러 발표로부터 저희들이 많은 이제 내용들을 배울 수 있었고요. 그다음에 이런 토론 과정을 통해서 그동안 불명확했던 것도 전부 다 조금 구체화될 수 있었던 것 같습니다. 이런 기회들이 코로나19로 인해서 실제 대면하지는 못하지만은 이런 온라인으로 이런 접촉할 수 있는, 네트워킹할 수 있는 기회들이 앞으로 더 많아졌으면 하고요. 다시 한번 발제자, 그다음에 패널리스트, 그다음에 오늘같이 기술적인 문제가 없이 이런 온라인 미팅이 이루어진 건 좀 저한테는 처음인 것 같은데, 이런 온라인 미팅 준비해 주신 여러 스태프들에게 다시 한번 또 감사드립니다. 오늘 수고 많으셨습니다. 땡큐. 고맙습니다.
Thank you.